Our story begins with a crazy guy looking at a totally badass painting of beings that seemed to be demonic. He kept smiling with a goofy look on his face, holding a baseball bat in his hand. His name is Dan, and his master, a short bald man, had called him. Dan was heading to his game, and explains to his boss that the finals were that day. The bald man declared that if Dan lost, he would have to enter the temple immediately, and Dan was screwed by the old man's way of supporting him, until a girl shows up. She was brushing her teeth, and he found it really weird that she was awake so early, but she just wanted him to give her his hand, and so, she gave him a keychain. Dan, being an idiot, didn't understand a thing, and the girl didn't even know he was so oblivious to it, because she was sure it was a cute little doll. He didn't think it was all that cute, while the girl lamented about not being very handy. In the end, the girl asks him to think of it as a lucky charm or something like that. Dan, seeing that she was the one who made that keychain, thanks her, promising that he would take great care of it, and with that, he rubs her head, amazed that she was suddenly doing something cute. She made it clear that he shouldn't touch her hair, giving Dan a massive kick to stop him from being a fool. The old man, poor guy, just stood there watching that mess unfold. That way, the old geezer asks him to come back in one piece. Dan tells him not to worry, promising he would win in style and return with that goofy face of his, and the old man trusted him. He had in mind that Dan would return as a winner. The scene cuts to the high school baseball championship. Guangdong was trying to overcome their slump, and Kim Dan was in the game, the man of the hour to everyone, considered the best in Korea at that moment. So, they were getting ready to make the pitch. Dan was feeling pretty confident, and then, the first pitch is thrown. Dan smashed the ball, sending it flying with brutal force. The ball flew higher and higher, until a kid in the bleachers ended up catching it, and everyone started cheering for the home run. Nobody could stop Dan, and he kept waving to everyone who was cheering for him. The announcer informed the crowd that they would be doing an interview with Dan. Next, the scene shifts to when the sun was already setting. Dan had won the high school tournament, so he hoped the draft would go well. He was a little regretful that he hadn't bought some rice cakes or something similar on his way back. Dan felt that his master was getting old, and honestly, he didn't even know if rice cakes were good for the bald man. Dan is so dumb that it only hit him right then that he was the one who won, so he was the one who should be getting at least some fried chicken. Suddenly, he takes a massive slap to the back of the head. It was the girl from earlier, the one who gave him the keychain. She wanted to know why he was walking around like a zombie, and on top of that, completely distracted. He was super pissed about the slap he took, while she kept threatening to tell the master if he tried anything, until he ended up noticing she had washed her hair, which made her really angry. At that, she informed him that his game had been broadcasted at school. He started acting all full of himself, as if he were the one and only genius to ever appear in Korea, and she found it hilarious that he was nothing more than a pathetic loser, making it very clear that he only succeeded because she had given him the lucky charm. Dan thanked her, pretending he actually believed that, which left her extremely irritated. With that, they arrived at the temple, and since he had won that day, he wanted to eat and leave her to wash the dishes. So, he opens the door and announces to the master that he had arrived. However, he is caught completely off guard. His master was on the floor, while a hooded figure stood in front of him. The girl hadn't seen it and didn't understand why Kim Dan was standing at the entrance like a bouncer, until her eyes widened, perplexed to see her master lying there on the ground. Dan was stunned, and the hooded figure made it very clear that this had nothing to do with him. But the guy is caught by surprise too, because Dan moves at an absurd speed and almost hits him right in the face with his baseball bat, telling Yena to run, though she was still worried about Dan. At that moment, he just wanted her to hurry up. Yena quickly started running away. Dan didn't understand what went down in that temple, or what happened to his master. Dan couldn't believe his master was dead, but he knew that first and foremost, he needed to take down that hooded guy. At the same time, he is relieved by the fact that the hooded guy is unarmed. The hooded figure then revealed that he would love to explain the whole situation, but he didn't have much time. With a very bright light in his hands, showing a crystal, the mysterious guy with red eyes apologizes that everything ended this way, leaving Dan with his mouth hanging open. Suddenly, the hooded figure lunged toward him, pressing his hand against Dan's chest. The white-haired guy, who looked bizarrely like Dan, even knew Dan's name and asked him to find enro. Dan was in total shock. That mysterious guy had the exact same face as him. Suddenly, Dan was thrown into some sort of black hole. He wanted to understand what the hell happened to the floor. He couldn't even scream. Dan's consciousness ends up drifting into limbo. He was worried about Yena and the master, until he sees a skull right in front of him, with centipedes crawling out of it. He realizes his face was planted on the ground, and lets out a massive scream upon seeing the skeleton, completely unable to understand the turn things had taken. Ultimately, he wanted to know where he was. He felt an absurd sense of weirdness being in that place. He looks behind him and sees an egg with some kind of insect inside, which freaked him out. To make matters worse, he was surrounded by eggs of that thing. Whatever it was, he really had no idea. Then, one of those eggs ends up bursting open, and the creature comes right at him. The hatching was happening in a chain reaction, with several of them bursting out of their eggs all at once. Dan, who only didn't shit his pants because he didn't have one brewing, just wanted to understand what the hell he was looking at. The useless guy only knew how to bat baseballs. He just stood there frozen frozen while a gigantic monster charged toward him, and he ended up getting stung by that monster, which made his veins bulge out. Dan started flailing his arm, and the weird monster finally backed away. His arm felt like it was on fire, and it looked ugly as hell, and he had no idea what those insects were, which started approaching him. He had managed to go to that bizarre place with his baseball bat, and so he grabbed that baseball bat and smashed those insects. The problem is that he isn't a god to face so many all at once. He knows he needed to get out of there no matter what, so he starts running, even without knowing where he was, and he had no idea what the hell that place was. It looked like a cave, and the big problem is that he wasn't finding anywhere he could hide from those insects. He didn't even have time to think, he just kept running until he ends up finding something that left him perplexed. He really was in a gigantic cave, and the idiot had only just realized it right then. At that, he looks back and sees that those small insects were heading toward him, which was bizarre, because they seemed to be much bigger. It gets increasingly ridiculous because Dan was afraid of those little creatures, and he started crushing all of them. But he is so dumb that he ends up falling into the water of that cave. However, his stupidity kind of saved him, as the insects weren't daring to enter the water. That is, until he feels something bizarre. Leeches suddenly appear and start trying to grab him. It was an endless gross out, and he quickly got out of that water. He was super pissed about the fact that there were monsters everywhere he went in that place. The poor guy just wanted to know where he was. He spent his whole life eating and breathing baseball, so he had never heard of anything like that. He didn't even know if he was in the world he used to live in, until he ends up putting his hand on something. It was the keychain that Yenna had given him as a gift. He has no idea how it got there, and assumed it was in his pocket, acknowledging that it really did end up becoming his lucky charm. And he remembers Yenna and also his master. He was very worried about them both. He was super pissed just thinking that the guy with the exact same face as his could hurt them both. At the same time, he was in denial. Dwelling on that wouldn't solve anything. He needed to pull himself together. He was certain there was something around there, so he stands up to take a look around. And actually, the idiot was smart this time, because there was a gigantic creature right behind him, and it was probably looking for a snack. Suddenly, he feels a pile of slime dripping onto his baseball bat. And after seeing the bizarre creature, he started breaking out in a cold sweat. The giant monster tries to hit him, but Dan narrowly escapes, wanting to understand what the hell that thing was. Every second, a new problem arose for the guy, and there wasn't much he could do in that moment. He needed to run away immediately. Eventually, he ends up finding a passageway in that cave and runs desperately. The gigantic insect almost caught him, but Dan took a leap and manages to squeeze into that small crevice. The monster tries to grab him no matter what, and its claw even gets close, but Dan ended up staying in one piece. The monster showed that things could get terrible, tearing up part of the ground with its claw. Dan had already fully soiled his underwear, until the gigantic insect decides to let it go. Dan hoped that creature had given up. He really thought he was going to end up dying right then and there. At that moment, he takes a look at his arm, seeing that ugly wound, remembering when the insect had stung him. The problem is that Dan wasn't feeling his arm. That was not good at all. His life was already hanging by a thread, and then there was that whole incident with his arm. He couldn't keep hiding around there. He needed to find a way out of that place. That is, until he ends up finding a little bit of light nearby. And it wasn't just light. He ended up seeing the shadow of a person. The idiot didn't even know where he was, and he called out to that person, letting them know he was over there. The fool was feeling grateful, since he had figured he was completely alone out there, until he sees something that leaves him completely stunned. He ends up seeing a skull with some insects on top of it, as if the insect were parasitizing that skull, and the skull quickly tried to bite a piece out of him. Dan was a guy who was good at dodging, and he manages to get away, but obviously, the fact that it was yet another monster was making him pretty irritated. That is, until he saw that it was the same type of insect that had struck his arm earlier, presuming that they are some kind of parasite, and either way, he needed to crush those pieces of crap so they wouldn't get close to him. But he didn't expect his baseball bat to break after he tried to smash that insect. Things got ugly for him, and the monster ends up taking a massive bite right out of his shoulder, like a horse. Dan quickly forces that skeleton away from him by shoving in whatever was left of his bat, until suddenly, the parasited skeleton charges toward Dan, knocking him to the ground and biting his arm, and it was exactly on that part where he had been stung by the insect. His arm started bleeding, while the bastard skeleton kept trying to chew on that part of his arm. Dan feels an absurd amount of pain. He grabbed a rock and bashed it into the skeleton's face so he could free himself. With that, he manages to get up and tried to finish off that skeleton by stoning it. And after a lot of effort, he actually managed to do it, tearing off part of that insect's body, but he was completely exhausted after doing that. And as if that weren't enough, several other bodies appeared there. They were the bodies of various creatures, and all of them were being parasitized by those hellish insects. Dan stood up with a 1,000-yard stare, wanting to see this through to the end. The guy was crazy, and he charges toward those creatures, wanting to fight every single one of them. While he punched one, he took a bite to the leg, and he tried to make that parasited dog let go of him by elbowing it, while another creature flew in his direction. However, he hears someone say that the whole situation was very funny. He looks to the side and can't believe it. It was simply the keychain that Yenna had given him. It was finding everything hilarious. Dan Dan wanted to understand what was going on with that doll. He didn't even know a doll could speak, and he begins to presume he was going crazy. He wanted to figure out who was talking to him, and the doll declared that it didn't matter at that moment, warning Dan that he was on the brink of death. So it ordered Dan to grab it, guaranteeing that he would live longer. And in that moment, Dan, who didn't know what to do, decides to hold on to that doll. But the parasited creatures didn't want to let him, and after he managed to grab that doll with everything he had, a gigantic explosion occurred. A blue-colored energy began to surround Dan, and it was even coming out of his eye. Something started forming in his hand, and it was simply a baseball bat. This left Dan quite surprised, because it wasn't a weapon or anything like that. It was simply a baseball bat. But before he could process everything that was happening, a creature started running toward him. Dan, whose eyes were glowing at that moment, swung at that creature, making the insect that was parasitizing that body practically explode. Even he was surprised by what he had just done, because he had completely torn off the torso of that creature. Dan felt like his power was overflowing. He began to believe that it was thanks to that baseball bat. He had no idea what it was, but he was certain that as long as he had it, he could handle all those creatures. In that moment, he didn't care to know what that place or that baseball bat was. He just wanted to steamroll through it all. Nothing else mattered to him, as he declared that he was going to crush all those creatures. After all, he just wanted to stay alive and understand what was going on. With that, the scene shifts to various creatures completely decimated on the ground. Dan was breathing heavily, and he couldn't understand what that baseball bat was. He felt the power coursing through his entire body. He kept asking himself if that was some kind of magic, until the baseball bat simply starts turning into smoke and vanishes from his hand, leaving him completely confused. The baseball bat turned into an entity, leaving him completely terrified, until suddenly, that weird smoke begins to eat the monsters. Dan has no idea why that smoke was doing that, until suddenly, that energy returned to his hands, becoming a baseball bat once again. And abruptly, Dan felt a sharp pang in his heart. He quickly drops to the ground, not understanding why he had felt that so suddenly, until he sees the energy from that baseball bat coming out through his arm. The wound seemed to be healing, but it wasn't just that one. The parts of his legs that the leeches had gotten to were also healing. He had practically all of his wounds healed in an instant. He was also feeling strangely stronger. He didn't know if that was the power of the baseball bat, but if it was truly incredible. And as long as he had it in his hands, Dan was certain he could survive in that place, wherever he was. That is, until his stomach started to rumble. The baseball player was starving. Next, the scene shifts to a blue mushroom. Dan kept staring at it and didn't understand a thing, but ultimately, it seemed like that was the best he could do in that moment. The problem is that mushrooms are risky because they can be poisonous. However, the idiot decides to eat it since he was completely screwed anyway. He'd rather die poisoned than starve to death, until he was completely shocked by the taste because he actually found it delicious. The gamble he took paid off. After regaining a bit of his strength, he went looking for the things he needed to survive. There were things resembling leeches living in the water, but he could at least drink the water, even if the sensation was extremely disgusting to him. It wouldn't have been surprising if something had gone wrong, and he didn't even know if he could eat those things. But thanks to the baseball bat, most of the time nothing bad happened. The harsh life of survival in the cave was at least sustainable because he had that mysterious power, and soon he began to get used to living inside that cave. The monsters wouldn't stop coming after him at all times. Dan was fully aware that this wasn't the world he used to live in. The insects seemed to parasitize the corpses of other creatures. The insects had hard shells, but it was so easy to kill them that it bordered on ridiculous. But he was well aware that all of this was possible thanks to the baseball bat. Whenever he took down monsters, the baseball bat would devour their corpses, and then it would return, healing his body and making Dan even stronger. That was how he ended up slowly adapting to that hellish place. He began to regain hope and the confidence that he could survive. He kept thinking that way until he found something. The place was infested with dangers, and definitely, the biggest danger he encountered was a massive and bizarre creature. The good thing was that the creature only prowled around the nest from time to time, and it didn't seem to do anything beyond that. Dan spent most of his time wandering through the cave and avoiding that monster, but he couldn't find the exit. He came to the conclusion that the exit was on the opposite side of the nest where he first woke up. The problem is that he would have to go through that hell. He might be able to deal with insects and monsters, but he didn't know if he could stop that bizarre thing. And even if he could, he had no idea if he would be able to get back to where his family was. Dan was terrified of being trapped in that hell forever. He had no idea how he ended up there. He only remembered falling from somewhere. He also had no idea who that guy with the exact same face as him was, though he remembered the hooded figure had told him to find something. But overthinking wouldn't help him at all in that moment. He needed to find a way out of there. So, he kept wandering inside that cave until he reached the area that was swarming with insects. Although he didn't see that enormous creature anywhere, which was a small blessing amidst all the crap he was dealing with out there. The insects didn't seem to be too sensitive either. Dan felt encouraged to do what he needed to do. But the guy was just incredibly unlucky. He simply ended up stepping on a bone, which made a noise, and he was scared to death. He stared at those eggs, not believing that the creatures hadn't hurt him. He was getting neurotic. He needed to be as careful little as humanly possible to make it to the other side, and he actually manages to do it, believing that he could leave that place. And he finds an opening at the top, and that spot had a ton of eggs as well. He didn't see any path leading outside, assuming it was a dead end, but looking up, he was certain he could get out of there. He just needed to find a way to climb up to that hole. That is, until he ends up stepping on something. He was standing right on top of the exact monster he wasn't looking for, proving that the guy really was incredibly lucky. Yena made a doll that truly brought him a whole lot of luck. And so, showing his immense luck, Dan takes a massive hit from the monster, making him spit blood right then and there. He ends up hitting the ground. He had no idea he was in that thing's nest the whole time. And then, the monster charges at him again. He was so screwed that he was using his baseball bat to get up, and the only thing left for him to do was to swing at the monster, which is exactly what he does. If you're in hell, you might as well hug the devil. He even made the monster bleed where the baseball bat hit, revealing a bizarre slime, and Dan liked the result. It was playing out very differently from when he saw that monster for the first time. The monster got even more pissed off, so Dan got ready to make another move. Dan's perception had always been good. After all, he needed it for baseball. But in that moment, that bastard was on another level, and so he swung with everything he had at that monster, which let out a very loud scream, and that monster's wound slowly began to open up. Dan was enjoying it, keeping in mind that he could actually beat that thing. However, when something seems too good to be true, you should be suspicious. But Dan is an idiot. The monster starts letting out a screech out of nowhere, leaving him pretty terrified and completely confused. A swarm of small insects starts appearing and heading toward the immense monster, which is their mother. Dan couldn't believe that was happening to him. However, he doesn't give up, swinging his baseball bat at every insect he sees in front of him, getting quite exhausted. And right after blowing up several insects, he sees that at the rate things were going, it would never end, and he has his limits. That is, until something massively terrible happens. The immense monster makes a rapid movement, to the point that Dan doesn't even have time to do anything. He was hit with full force. The insect mother's claw went right through him. Drawing a lot of blood from the poor guy, he trembled, but he still had the baseball bat in one of his hands. With an infernal rage, he swung at the insect mother's claw that had wrecked him from front to back. The creature screamed, as he caused considerable damage, to the point of ripping that claw right off. He was free, and so, without wasting time, he pulled out the claw that was lodged inside him. He starts bleeding profusely, and soon his vision began to get increasingly blurry, because he was losing a lot of blood. He was breathing very heavily. Dan convinced himself that this was the end for him. He really didn't think he could beat that thing. He also had no idea what that monster wanted from him, until he feels someone's presence by his side, warning him that he should fight, leaving his eyes wide open. A girl was right in front of him. It was Yena, who wanted to remind him not to give up right there. He shouldn't even think about it. Dan was left completely confused, because Yena hadn't ended up in that place along with him. He wanted to know how she was doing so well. Meanwhile, she ignored him completely, wanting him to get up already, informing him that the master and she were waiting for him, so he should get up and stand firm. Obviously, that messed with his head, so Dan looked to the side and grabbed his baseball bat. That mysterious energy that looked like smoke appeared, and he kept swinging at those insects. Dan, who at that moment had the energy of that smoke surrounding his body, was getting tired of those insects. The smoke was looking more like a mask on him, and in that moment, he charges at the monster with everything he had, delivering a brutal strike to that monster, tearing off a chunk of it, until that mysterious energy vanished. Dan then wanted to understand how he had that strength. He was feeling relieved that he was finally getting out of there. However, he ends up seeing that energy leaving the baseball bat and going to eat again. And at the end of the day, Dan just couldn't get used to seeing that kind of thing. Until suddenly, that energy entered inside him once more, and it quickly healed that very severe wound he had. And either way, as much as it was a good thing, Dan just couldn't get used to it. More than that, that power was on a completely different level compared to when he absorbed other monsters, so he was left wondering if his strength increased, depending on how strong his opponent was. Anyway, he didn't know what was waiting for him outside, and he ended up stepping out, seeing that immense brightness hit his face. He just had in mind that with that power, he could defend himself somehow. That is, until he was left visibly perplexed. He was simply in a desert. Dan was truly crazy. He thought that a desert was still better than a damp cave, getting pretty excited to have made it out. But a while after he had gotten out, he fell to his knees, completely deflated, seeing that he was wrong. That place was much more deserted than he imagined. There was nothing he could eat, let alone anything to drink. The only things he was finding were walking skeleton monsters. And either way, after everything he lived through in the cave, that didn't impress him. Dan got very stressed, because he fought so hard to survive, only to end up starving to death at the end of it all. There wasn't a single person in sight. It was just monsters. He starts to ask himself if maybe humanity had gone extinct from the world. And so, he closed his eyes, hoping that when he opened them the next time, all of this would just be a dream, until he hears a person sounding quite enthusiastic to see that someone was out there. He opened his eyes on high alert. It was a girl named Chloe. She was with a guy who asked her not to approach like that. Next, the scene shifts to Chloe looking quite irritated, wanting to know when Dan was going to stop crying. He was emotional over the fact that he had found the first people after such a long time. He was also very happy about the fact that they spoke the same language. Chloe was feeling disgusted by the fact that he was all slimy, while the white-haired guy wanted Dan to calm down a bit. The man wanted to chat for a moment with the baseball player. Chloe didn't like that one bit, because they had a long way to go, and the guy was standing there wanting to stop and chat. The white-haired man explains that the boy they just found was very happy, and it seemed like he hadn't seen anyone in a very long time, so the man just couldn't bring himself to ignore Dan. Besides, Chloe had also gotten all excited and ran after him when she found him. She sulked, knowing it was true. Anyway, they end up sitting down and setting up a campfire. Dan kept staring at the stew that was cooking over the campfire, looking like a psychopath. He couldn't believe it. It had been a long time since he had seen real food. Chloe could tell by the look on his face that he hadn't eaten in days. Dan was drooling, explaining that he hadn't eaten anything for about 5 days. Chloe thought it was impossible for someone to survive after going 5 days without eating, and Dan explained that he might only be alive because of the power he had, since he absorbed monsters. And the white-haired man had never heard of magic like that, and Dan was shocked to learn that there was magic around there. Chloe, seeing that he didn't even know there was magic there, wanted to know where he was from. Dan was trying to find a way to explain it, and the man gave Dan a bowl with some stew, having complete patience to listen to Dan's story. And after eating like a desperate man, those two who had found Dan understood that he came from another world and woke up there. And when he took down monsters with his baseball bat, his body healed and became even stronger. The funny thing is that those two called the baseball bat a club. The man thought Dan's ability was quite unusual, and Chloe ended up noticing that the undead were quiet that night, and she didn't understand the reason for that. Dan informed her that he ended up taking down all those undead. The girl couldn't even believe it. Meanwhile, the mysterious man kept thinking. After all, the undead in that place kept resurrecting non-stop every night. It was completely useless to crush them all. The big thing was that Dan had said they were absorbed, so the man presumed they wouldn't move anymore. They simply had no way of coming back. Therefore, he was certain there was something strange about that weapon. Then, the man stood up, declaring that for the first time, thanks to Dan, he would be able to get a decent night's sleep. And since Dan had nowhere to go, the man asked him to tag along with them, saying he could help him return to his original world. That was the moment Chloe ended up revealing that guy's name, which was Ares. She couldn't believe he was doing that, while Dan declared he would be very grateful for Ares' help. Chloe, on the other hand, with her ears, didn't like that one bit. Next, the scene shifts to Chloe cutting some cacti. She picked them up and stored them in a bag. Dan was quite surprised. He never imagined that those were edible. Chloe explained that to cross an uninhabited desert like that, they needed to have some basic knowledge. Dan, who knew absolutely nothing, just stared at her with a goofy look on his face, wanting to soak up every kind of information from that little girl, while she couldn't understand what kind of face he was making. At that, he explained that she reminded him of his sister when she was still a kid. Chloe kicked him in the leg, saying she was already all grown up. Dan had really joined the two of them, and ultimately, Chloe walked alongside him and learned that in Dan's world, there were no people with ears like hers. Traveling with those two, Dan ended up learning a lot about that world. From Chloe, who introduced herself as a beast girl, he learned survival skills and the common sense he needed to stay alive. And the middle-aged man named Ares ended up teaching Dan about monster ecology and how to fight against them. Those two were there to take down the boss of the monsters. Dan felt lucky to have found two good people. He didn't know exactly what kind of people lived in that world, but he felt good vibes coming from those two. Next, the scene shifts to nighttime. Dan kept looking at the doll he had received from Yenna, until Ares noticed that he hadn't gone to sleep yet and approached while holding a lantern. Dan explained that his mind was full of thoughts. Ares assumed the boy was thinking about his home, and he was curious. Ares had lived in that world for a long time, and Dan was the first person he had ever met who actually came from another world. Dan made it very clear to Ares that compared to his world was pretty boring, and Ares imagined that it was all very peaceful. Suddenly, Dan realized that his world was exactly what Ares had said, and how his miserable life back there was far more comfortable than the one he was living in this world. At that, he wanted to know if Ares had ever heard of baseball. He kept in mind that he would do anything to be able to return to his world. Then, the scene shifts to a gigantic red dragon, a massive red dragon, charging toward Dan, who was with Chloe, and they were desperate, proving that returning to his world would have to take a back seat. The main priority was surviving. They ran like their lives depended on it. Dan told Chloe to go first. She was worried, while he grabbed his baseball bat and swung right at that red dragon's face. But it wasn't enough. The dragon quickly managed to hit him, sending Dan flying a few meters. Chloe was incredibly worried about him. Dan had gotten a little hurt, but he was in one piece, and the dragon once again, without even giving him a second to breathe, charged in his direction and tried to attack him. But Ares appears with his sword in hand and finishes off the dragon. He wanted to know if Dan was okay. Chloe assumed that Ares had taken way too long, and she also wanted to know if Dan had gotten hurt anywhere, but he expressed that everything was fine. That was the moment the smoke came out of the baseball bat and went straight for the red dragon to have its meal. Ares and Chloe were completely shocked seeing that, and rapidly, Dan was completely healed. Chloe immediately immediately wanted to know if that was the absorption Dan had mentioned earlier, and he confirmed it. Ares witnessed that the corpse had disappeared without a trace. He was left speechless in that moment, until he revealed to Dan that there was something he wanted Dan to do. Next, the scene shifts to them sitting around a campfire after night had already fallen. Chloe thought Ares was losing his mind, wanting Dan to go after the lich. To Chloe, that was basically sending Dan to his own death, making it very clear that Ares could just stick to the plan and kill the lich himself. Ares told her not to worry, because he wouldn't force Dan to go if he refused. Chloe, on the other hand, thought it was endlessly messed up, especially since the baseball player didn't know just how strong a lich is. She figured that, given how much of an idiot Dan was, he would just end up dying. That is, until Dan made it perfectly clear that he was going to try and kill the lich. So, he wanted to know what his first step should be. Then, the scene shifts to when they were already eating. Ares suggested that Dan do a checkup. Chloe couldn't understand, but Ares remembered very well that the boy had said he didn't quite understand his own abilities, and Dan really didn't know much. Ares, before they faced the lich, thought it best for Dan to know what he could do, how his ability worked, and where its limits were. Chloe agreed with him. Dan judged that to be fair, as he was also curious about what his baseball bat could do, so he got excited and wanted to know when they could start. Then, the scene shifts to Dan completely bored, his baseball bat on the ground. Chloe simply declared that he was going to measure his mana. Dan was shocked to learn that he had mana, and Chloe in the end just figured he should have it. It wasn't a certainty, especially since everyone has mana, and Ares declared that he would start by taking a quick look at Dan so they could better understand what was happening with that strange weapon he has. In Ares' vision, and also at his mana, Dan took it the wrong way and got quite embarrassed, but that wasn't exactly what Ares meant. Soon, Ares begins to let his mana flow, where he basically found himself in Dan's consciousness, and was left perplexed seeing that smoke, which goes right at him, forcing him to let go of Dan. And Dan, confused, wanted to know if it was already over, and anxiously, he wanted to know if Ares ended up discovering anything. However, Ares denies it. He couldn't reach a conclusion. Dan felt a bit sad about that, and Ares expected that it would be difficult to classify him as a normal human, because it seemed like there was another living being inside Dan. And just from having felt an absurd rejection, Ares judged that this power is dangerous. Next, the scene shifts to a walking skeleton with an axe in its hands, and as soon as the poor skeleton looked forward, it ended up taking a massive rock to the face. Dan really had good aim, and it had already been a long time since he had arrived in that world. He hadn't even counted exactly, but he was sure that 3 months had already passed since he had been there, and he had no idea how many monsters he had ended up absorbing in that time. His body had already far surpassed what anyone would call a normal human, and in the end, that place was infested with unknown monsters. Chloe called him to eat, and he only resisted because of those monsters, because of his comrades. Next, the scene shifts again to the empty bowl. He had eaten everything and had a full belly. He praised Chloe, as he really liked her food, while she kept bragging about having a special seasoning. And in the end, Dan had barely finished eating and was already thinking about dinner, while the conceited girl promised to leave him impressed at dinner time. Ars noticed that Dan was very good with younger people. At that, he wanted to know how what he had taught Dan was going, and Dan had learned about controlling mana, but he wasn't doing well at all. He couldn't feel anything, which left him frustrated, and he begins to believe he has no talent whatsoever. Ars already figured it might be too much. Dan didn't seem to be the mage type, just like Ars himself is. In the end, he didn't want Dan to get discouraged, presuming that Dan's body was already under the influence of mana, and if he kept practicing, one day he would be able to control his mana. Dan got excited, and at the end of the day, he is pretty strong. Despite not being able to control his mana, he just wanted to be useful when they fought against this lich. Chloe looked at Ares from the corner of her eye, waiting for him to speak. She was already aware. Ares informed Dan that he wouldn't fight the lich directly, leaving the boy confused. Ares acknowledges that Dan is quite strong, but he wasn't at the ideal level to face a lich. So, Dan's goal in that fight would be to absorb the lich's corpse after Ares himself defeated the lich. Dan understood and felt a bit awkward. Ares was doing that solely to ensure Dan's safety, and also asked Dan not to worry so much. Ares also informs him that they would reach their destination in just a few more days, so they should all rest as much as they could. Next, the scene shifts to the three of them walking, and obviously, they ended up encountering some monsters along the way. They would stop to take shelter for the night and make their campfires to eat, always ensuring a good meal, and would go back to walking in the morning. That was their routine, until Chloe, carrying a very small backpack, started feeling quite tired and sat on the ground. Ares asked her to hold on a little longer, because when they reached the end of that canyon, they would find the entrance to the tomb. Dan tried to motivate the girl, and she ends up getting excited, and they continue walking, until the scene shifts to them finding the lich's Asura's tomb. They went down a staircase until they found a corridor. Dan thought that place was very clean. Chloe got even more nervous because things were so organized, while Aries warned the two of them not to lower their guards, as they could end up being surprised at any moment. Dan saw things looking so organized that he highly doubted a ghost would appear out of nowhere, until he ends up feeling something and looks back, joking around as if a ghost could appear behind him. And the ghost declared that Dan had caught him, leaving the baseball player with his mouth hanging open. And before the ghost could greet him, Dan ends up taking a swing at the ghost, which quickly falls to the ground and begins to dissolve. He had no idea he could hit a ghost with a baseball bat. It was just a reflex. He was feeling even more determined to hit them after that, as they continued walking. Dan, despite being on that adventure with those two, had no idea what a lich was. Ares explained that a lich is the ruler of the land of the dead. He resurrects and commands the countless undead in that place. And at that exact moment, a skull appears. Ares explained to Dan that if a lich revives and fully recovers its power, it will lead an army of undead and destroy the whole world. So, they needed to defeat that damned creature before it could fully recover its strength. And even if it could be killed, magic would bring it back in 100 years. And when Ares saw what Dan could do, if he could absorb the undead and erase their existence, then he should be able to do the same thing that Ares's own master did. Dan understood, hoping it wouldn't be that hard. However, he has no idea if his baseball bat would actually follow the plan. He also informed Ares that that mysterious energy didn't absorb all monsters, and not even he knew exactly how it worked, until he ends up stepping on something that catches Ares's attention, and Chloe asks Dan to wait a moment, and he was just zoning out. Ares, desperate, yells for Dan to get out of the way immediately. A magic circle had appeared right beneath Dan, and the idiot wasn't understanding a thing, and suddenly, he ended up being teleported, leaving those two completely stunned by what had just happened. So Ares grabs the girl and takes off running at a brutal speed. Chloe couldn't understand why he was doing that. She also had no idea what the hell happened to Dan, while Ares was very upset with himself. He was sure he had ended up missing something. In a place like that, it wasn't surprising at all that something of that sort could happen, and he just didn't want to arrive too late. Next, the scene shifts to Dan on the ground. He was waking up a bit dizzy, not understanding what the hell that light was that had appeared around him. He looked from side to side, not knowing where he was, until he ends up seeing a gigantic gate right in front of him. In the end, the poor guy didn't know if the lich was behind that door, but he was grateful for the fact that he didn't end up falling into a trap that would get him sliced in half. So, he prefers to stay calm and wait for Ares to show up. The scene shifts to a skeleton inside its split head, with the brutal speed that Ares was moving, while Chloe just wanted to understand the reason for all that. And since he didn't want to leave the blonde girl in the dark, he explains that Dan had stepped on the teleportation circle to the lich. If their guess was right, he was sure the boy should be in the chamber, and Dan's eyes were wide open. He was seeing a being sitting on its throne. He was getting very nervous, but he still had no idea if it was the lich, and to make matters worse, the creature seemed to be sleeping, and ultimately, he just needed to not wake that monstrosity up. Dan was scared, and to make matters worse, he thought he was on the outside of that door, but no, he was inside. He decides to stay quiet, so he wouldn't end up triggering another trap until he feels something. It was the mysterious energy that was surrounding him. He couldn't understand why it was appearing so suddenly, especially since that energy had never done that before. And that was when things went completely south for Dan. The lich ended up waking up. The lich rose from its throne and displayed a brutal energy. Dan became quite worried. He was certain he was completely screwed in that moment. Next, the scene shifts to Ares, running with the blonde girl in his arms. They heard a very loud noise. Ares hoped it wasn't the worst case scenario, and believed the lich had ended up waking up. At that, Dan was on the ground, completely in shock. He was fully convinced that creature was on a whole other level. And suddenly, the lich's magic grew bigger and bigger. Dan, seeing that, presumed he wouldn't be able to escape, so he decides to use his baseball bat as if he were in a game. Then, he swung right at the leech's power, which was quite heavy, sending the leech's attack back in the direction of the monster itself, taking it by surprise. In the end, the magic caused absolutely no damage to the leech. Dan wasn't expecting that. He had no idea how he could defeat a monster like that. Suddenly, the lich made another move, making a bunch of spikes shoot out of the ground. Dan manages to dodge, but he ends up getting caught by his arms and legs, falling into despair. The lich noticed that Dan's power was quite unusual and wanted to know if Dan's source was his heart. And to make the situation worse, it got very curious, deciding to see for itself, wanting to cut Dan open. But before it could do the absolute worst to the boy, the lich ends up getting a slash across its wrist. The cut obviously came from Ares. He had arrived in time, and at that moment the old man wanted to know if Dan had gotten hurt anywhere. Dan right then had even forgotten how to speak. He was probably scared shitless. Ares asks him to step back, saying he would take care of everything from that moment on. The lich made a move toward Ares, and a massive explosion occurred. Dan shielded his eyes, and he was also worried about Ares. However, the old man quickly launched an attack toward the lich, showing that the blast hadn't even scratched him. He sliced the lich right in half, which was truly incredible, but the lich rapidly recovered, and at the end of the day, it was fully aware that Ares had a connection to it, it, through a sad twist of fate, it brought its hands together and began to generate a new attack. Dan was left with his mouth hanging open, wanting to understand what the hell was going on. The name of the attack the Lich had prepared for Ares is the End of the Stars. The explosion was extremely violent, and that idiot Dan just stayed in the exact same spot instead of getting as far away as he possibly could. Ultimately, Ares, incredibly, was still standing. His sword was planted into the ground. That wasn't enough to kill him, and he was still blocking the attack so it wouldn't hit Dan. The Lich found it very strange, because Ares had always faced it alone, but this time he had brought a stranger along. So, it begins to presume that Ares had prepared some sort of trump card to be able to defeat it. But the Lich clarified that Ares wasn't the only one who had a gift there, and it brought its hands together once again, invoking an ability called Whisper of the Void. That was the moment Ares began to worry. Basically, the Lich had created a space that it declared was just for Ares, planning to challenge the old man right there, one-on-one. And despite the Lich doing that first, it wanted to take a look at Dan, treating him as if he were a gift from Ares. And in the end, it believed that Dan himself was the dagger that Ares had brought to pierce its heart, but it made it clear that this blade would end up being pointed at Ares himself. At that moment, the old man was worried because he couldn't move even a single centimeter, presuming it must be some kind of magic from the mental realm. It wasn't something that belonged to reality, and maybe he wouldn't break free so easily. Under normal circumstances, it would take Ares some time to figure out a way to break that spell, but he is aware that he can't afford to waste that much time, because the life of his companion Dan was in danger, and he just wanted the boy to hold on a little longer. And right then, the fool Dan was in shock, feeling like he truly was trash in that moment. The Lich made it very clear that as the ruler of all the dead and the terror of the living, Dan should offer up everything. It was after the boy's flesh and the power he possessed, displaying an absurd amount of greed, but the mysterious energy that was inside Dan made it very clear who that vessel belonged to. It turned into a fight to see who was going to use that body, and the energy found the Lich very audacious for stepping into its domain without any fear whatsoever. The Lich didn't understand. It didn't recognize that mysterious energy. Suddenly, the Lich's magic ended up dissolving, and the Lich was super pissed at Ares, wanting to know what that old man had brought into its tomb, showing that this energy was no joke. Ares was old but still quick. He realizes that this was the moment to strike, and so, he uses the butcher's art and sliced that Lich in half, which the Lich deemed impossible. The energy that was inside Dan's body assisted Ares, and in that moment, Dan ended up collapsing. He was feeling a headache and had no idea what was causing it. The bat quickly began to glow, and the leech's mana went in Dan's direction and began to wrap around his body. The poor guy started feeling an absurd amount of pain, while Ares had no idea what he could do in that moment. He was seeing a gigantic amount of mana being absorbed by Dan, and right after the boy had absorbed everything, Ares grew worried about the fact that he might end up losing control. And since Dan was on the ground, Ares didn't know that it was a reaction from having absorbed a leech's power, until suddenly, he hears someone calling for Lord Asclepius, and Ares immediately looked in the direction where that voice had come from. Once again, Dan ends up hearing that he should look for Einer, and he woke up quite startled and screaming. At that, he looked for the old man and the blonde girl. Seeing that he was alone, he wanted to know where everyone had gone. That is, until he ends up seeing the backpack and a written piece of paper on the ground, where Ares informs the boy that something urgent had come up, so they had to leave first, and also informs him that thanks to Dan, the Lich had been defeated. That leaves him completely confused because he had never seen that writing before, so he shouldn't be able to read it. At that, he reflects on the most important thing. He thought those two had ended up abandoning him. Next, the scene shifts to Ares, who in that moment wanted to know what brought a woman there. Her name is Akinis, and she informs him that the Imperial Majesty had summoned him, calling him Lord Asclepius, and he found it very strange that it was so sudden. He was already grabbing his sword, while Aquinos didn't see any surprise in that, especially since the Majesty never asked for permission, and in the end, he stayed on high alert. While he was talking to her, she opened a portal, informing him that he would hear the details when he was at the palace, especially because she figured he had already finished up around there anyway. And when he was about to leave, Chloe appears, wanting to know if Dan was okay. Chloe hadn't noticed the woman earlier, and was quite frightened, and she quickly tried to wake Dan up. Ares tried to calm the girl down, explaining that the shock of absorbing the Lich had ended up leaving the boy dazed, but Dan's life wasn't in danger, and at the end of the day, there were several things that bothered the old man. However, he asks Chloe to pack some food, a map, and a small bag to leave with Dan, and she was left completely confused, but she ends up doing what he was ordering. Aquinos sees that Dan then had really managed to absorb the Lich, and she had a smile on her face because she found that very interesting, showing that she got very excited. And right after they had packed everything up and left it for Dan, Ares went over to Aquinos, leaving a warning for her. She should lose interest in that boy immediately. He said that in case she wanted to have a long life. So, the three of them end up entering the gate. Aquinos would keep what she heard from Ares in mind. And so, right after all that had happened, Dan was feeling like complete crap. The poor fool was teary-eyed, because even though they hadn't traveled together for very long, he truly believed the three of them were like a family. He couldn't believe that Chloe and Aries had left him completely alone. He was practically having a breakdown, but he prefers to imagine they had a reason for doing that. Aries had said in the letter that Dan had helped defeat the leech, but he didn't remember doing anything. He also wasn't feeling any stronger, presuming that the strange energy that lives alongside him hadn't ended up absorbing the leech. In that moment, everything was a mystery to the boy. That is, until he got a look on his face like he wanted to cause some trouble. He figured he should look for something valuable for himself. Since he had defeated an absurdly powerful boss, he judged that something would be worth it, and he simply picked up a cursed elf skull orb. He also got the Staff of Pain and Despair, and several other legendary, unique, and heroic grade items. But he prefers to leave everything right there, afraid those things would end up affecting his life negatively. He also noticed that Chloe and Aries left a map and a compass for him. As a person who had always used a smartphone, using that kind of thing would be quite complicated for him. And from what he was seeing on the map, there was a village to the west, past the forest. And just by looking at the path, he was already aware that it was far. He sighed over the fact that he was alone again. Next, the scene shifts to him taking a swing at a skeleton. It had already been 3 months since he separated from Aries and the little girl. He had crossed that desert alone, and thanks to the knowledge he learned from those two, he made it to Alice without any problems. Even though the journey had been extremely lonely, he was finally leaving that desolate place behind because he had found the forest. After almost a year, the poor guy was seeing fresh grass and trees again. Finally, he was seeing something peaceful and beautiful instead of monsters and sandstorms. Until an explosion ends up happening inside the forest, ruining the good vibe he was having in that moment. It was too good to be true. At that, the scene shifts to a blonde guy running desperately, until suddenly, an explosion happens right where he was. He fell to the ground completely screwed and covered in dirt, wanting to understand how there was a wyvern in that place. The dragon was out for blood and wanted to destroy him. The guy soon realized he was wrong. Even Robert, the strongest among them, ended up getting killed and couldn't even fight back. That guy was just a copper rank hunter. There wasn't much he could do. The poor guy went to that place to exterminate some goblins, and ended up being found by a gigantic dragon, which let out a massive roar in his direction. The boy was certain that this was the end for him, until a creature appears, defending him. It was a beast girl. Her name is Alyosha, and that blonde kid's name is Alt. Alyosha couldn't understand why he was just sitting there on the ground, telling him to get his ass up. Alt couldn't comprehend why she had come back, since he was supposed to be the bait for her to escape. And in the end, Alyosha didn't think it was cool at all to take all the credit for herself, and Alt was grateful she was there. Either way, he wanted to know if she had a plan. Alyosha thought his question was incredibly stupid, because if she actually had a plan, Robert wouldn't be dead right now. She informed him that she would count to 3, so they could run without looking back, and he simply agreed with her. Alyosha then began to count, but the wyvern didn't even give her the time, leaving Alt completely shocked. Alyosha immediately went down after that attack. Suddenly, some arrows grazed past Alt, hitting the wyvern's face, but they had absolutely no effect. Alt couldn't believe it. It was Celis who had fired in the dragon's direction, and she, practically on the verge of crying, wanted to apologize to Alt, because she didn't think it was fair to be the only one who could escape. And in that moment, Alt told her to run as fast as she possibly could, but before she could even move, the wyvern leaped, charging straight at her. Celis, being completely useless, just stood there, as if waiting for a miracle to happen. And just as her tear began to fall, Dan appears, taking a swing at that green dragon's head. The two of them ended up being taken by surprise. Dan arrived just like those heroes. Alt and Celis, right after that, thanked Dan for what he had done. But to Dan, he didn't do anything special, and Alt grabbed his hand, being quite weird, asking Dan not to think like that, and declaring that he was a lifesaver. And it was a fact that if Dan hadn't shown up at that exact moment, both of them would be dead, and Alyosha was alive. She was just injured on the ground. Alt was still perplexed that someone would appear in the forest and defeat that wyvern with just one strike. So, he wanted to know if the baseball player was a high-level hunter, with Celis and Alt presuming he was a gold or even platinum tier hunter. But since they didn't get any answer, they were left confused. So Dan wanted to know what the hell they were talking about, causing a huge misunderstanding among the three of them. Next, the scene shifts to Alt carrying Alyosha, and Dan had told them that he ended up coming from another world. Dan imagines that it would be hard for those guys to believe, but Alt simply blindly trusted the one who was his savior. And Celis had never heard of that, but since teleportation spells and things like that existed, she believed that traveling between dimensions could be entirely possible. Alt agreed with her, and at the end of the day, not even they knew the secrets that world held. And Dan sees that, indeed, cases like his are not common at all. And Alt made it very clear that Dan's feat left them incredibly shocked. They also remembered Dan's weird energy suddenly appearing and devouring the wyvern's corpse. And since everyone in that world knew a baseball bat as a club, they couldn't forget that the baseball bat was radiating an incredible magical power. Alt, with his eyes sparkling, wanted to know if everyone in Dan's world had special abilities like him. Dan didn't quite know how to explain it. Anyway, he couldn't even get a word in, because the two of them got so excited. At that, Alt informs him that they were almost there. They were in the easternmost territory of the Kingdom of Lamenia, called Shiltrock. Dan, like a total fool, starts crying when he arrives at the place. Alt got worried that something had ended up happening. Dan wasn't seeing anything negative. He explained that, in the end, he had just gotten emotional because it had been a long time since he had seen so many people. Next, the scene shifts to Dan eating and drinking like a desperate man. He never imagined that his first legal drink as an adult would end up happening in another world. Even though he hadn't tasted it in his world, he presumed that the alcohol in that world tasted a little different. He kept remembering Celis and Alt's names. The two had said they were going to take care of their comrades and come back. Remembering when Alt had said they were going to handle Alyosha's treatment and recover Robert's body. And Dan felt sad knowing that they had ended up losing a party member, imagining it was a very difficult time. Alt was still a really good guy for giving Dan a reward, so he could rest at a nearby inn, and Dan hoped they could really meet up after he rested for a bit. After all, he truly was in a completely different world from his own. There were even people with cute animal ears, and at the end of the day, he didn't know what to do first, presuming it would be better to sleep. Next, the scene shifts to him waking up, completely wrecked. It had been a long time since he had slept in a bed, so he ended up passing out, sleeping like a rock, until someone knocks on the door, and he answers it. Celis was accompanied by Alyosha, and she wanted to know if Dan had slept well. At that, Dan ends up going downstairs with them. Alt was waiting downstairs, and he greeted Dan with a whole lot of excitement. So, they decide to have breakfast together. Alt explained that Alyosha had an overwhelming urge to thank Dan personally, but she didn't even want to admit it. Alt confessed that he was too shaken up the day before to thank him properly. Either way, Dan was grateful to them, because he managed to sleep very well. Alt introduced himself properly to Dan, explaining that he is a copper-tier hunter from the party called the Righteous Travelers, and his party member is Alyosha, who thanked Dan for what he did the day before. She is a beast girl, and Celis was the only rearguard member the party had, and she was also the prettiest. Dan, taking advantage of the fact that they were introducing themselves, wanted to know what hunters and rankings were. Alyosha ended up hearing that, and was left confused. And Dan was confused, because it seemed to be very offensive to ask that kind of thing. He also remembered Ares mentioning silver and gold, and Alt felt that he had ended up being rude and hadn't explained about the place to Dan. He explains that hunters are people who hunt wild beasts or monsters, accepting all kinds of requests, where they needed to be registered with the Hunters Guild to do all that. Hunters usually work in parties. The minimum is 2 people, but the most common setup was forming a party of 4 people. The rankings are handled by the guild, and they assigned the ranks to the hunters. The lowest was steel, and the highest was mithril. Some parties had mixed rankings, but even so, you could only accept requests based on the lowest rank in the party, so it was easier for people to team up with others of the same rank. Steel and copper hunters mainly hunted wild animals and lesser monsters. They also took care of the minor jobs. The ranks that focused on monsters were the silver hunters, who were veterans. Most people ended their hunting careers without ever reaching the silver rank. On the other hand, gold rank hunters are the high-quality workforce, but from gold upwards, it became increasingly rare. As for platinum hunters, Alt heard that there aren't even 20 of them in the entire guild. He had never met one in his life. As for the mithril rank hunters, they say that only 10 have ever existed in the continent's history, and only 3 mithril hunters were currently active. They are considered living legends. Dan was taking in the whole situation while eating. The ranking didn't just measure strength, it brought status and credibility. There was even a black market for lost hunter badges, but the price was very high. To get a badge, you needed to complete many guild requests, and the Righteous Travelers party was copper rank. It wasn't anything special, but it was enough to survive. Dan's head was about to explode from so much information, and Alt, after saying all that, wanted to know if Dan was down to join their party. Dan was taken by surprise by that question. Alt was worried he might end up pressuring him or something like that. He was just explaining to Dan that to live in that world, he needed money and status, and they were down one member in the party, seeing as Robert had passed away. Dan sees that the guy was completely right, because he needed to adapt to that society while he looked for a way to return to his world. He needed cash and knowledge. Alyosha, out of nowhere, stood up from the table and presumed that Dan was extremely strong, because she found out he defeated a wyvern with just 1 strike, which was something extraordinary. However, a person ended up overhearing their conversation, absolutely certain that it was a lie. She was sure there was no way someone could kill a wyvern with just 1 strike. It was a blonde girl who thought that even lies had their limits. Dan was pissed off because an annoying person had just shown up. Alyosha told that blonde girl, whose name is Mary, to stay out of their conversation. Mary tried to insult Alyosha, treating her like an animal that shouldn't be sharing a table with people. And Mary was from a party called Oppressive Noble, complaining about the fact that Alyosha was shedding fur everywhere, and that like an animal, she should be eating on the floor. Alyosha got quite irritated, and Alt had to hold Alyosha back, showing that those two had a lot of tension. And Mary had never seen Dan before, and wanted to know if he was really the one who had killed the wyvern. Before he could even try to explain himself, she didn't even let him. She wanted to know if he brought back any trophies, because he could have gotten a good amount of money that way. Alt explained that some circumstances happened that made that impossible, trouble, and Mary immediately believed she had caught them in a lie because there was no way that could happen. It sounded like complete absurdity to her, and Dan felt that he had stayed quiet long enough. He lost his patience, but Mary simply threatened him, making it very clear that he couldn't do anything about it. That left Dan extremely pissed off, making it clear that this girl knows exactly how to get on someone's nerves. He called her a dwarf, and she started trying to insult him gratuitously, even after she had provoked him first. That is, until a guy appeared, apologizing to Dan, and Dan was left confused while that guy kept smiling at him. Mary did not like that a guy named Briand had simply butted into their conversation. Briand apologized to her, but he felt the need to bring a little calm, suggesting that she cool her head and sit down. Briand was also an oppressive noble, and he kept trying in every way to convince her to go back to her corner and eat something. Meanwhile, Dan did not like any of it, and wanted to know who that guy was, the one interrupting their conversation, with a very strange kind of coldness. Briand made it clear that they should stop right there. When Dan saw the look on that guy's face, he felt a little awkward, but he stayed sharp. Those two were there to get on his nerves. Tension surrounded the three of them, until suddenly, a very small girl came over and wanted to know why the three of them were so tense. She also made it very clear to Briand that Mary herself had started everything, and Briand quickly let out a sigh. The small girl apologized to Dan, explaining that the story about taking down a wyvern with just one hit was not something everyone could easily believe. She tried to explain why Mary had been so rude. That girl was named Erin, and she was a dwarf, also an oppressive noble. Dan did not understand it, because the smallest person among all of them seemed to be the most mature one. Meanwhile, Erin scolded Mary because she had already talked to her about looking for trouble with other people, but it seemed like Mary actually enjoyed a mess. At that moment, Dan looked at the people who were with him, and they looked worried, so he chose to stay cool, making it clear that he did not want any problems. Erin was grateful that he understood, while Dan asked Erin to take Mary away because she really got on his nerves. That damn girl kept sticking her tongue out at him while hiding behind Briand. After that, Dan sat down, and Celis thought Dan had handled it very well, since Mary had a sharp tongue and loved being annoying. Then Dan wanted to know what he should do first to become a hunter. Alt then handed him something, explaining that he only needed to pay the registration fee. Dan saw that money really was what ended up deciding everything. Alt wanted to know if he had money, because Alt had not given him much earlier. Dan remembered that his old companions might have given him a little, and after taking a look, he saw that he had 1 gold coin. Alt told him that 1 gold coin was equal to 1,000 crowns, and that each coin had its own set value. Dan got really excited, believing he had a good amount of money, and Alt confirmed it, explaining that the registration fee cost 500 crowns. That left Dan completely frustrated, because it was basically half of everything he had, and with Dan's hunter registration done, it was time for everyone to leave, which Dan did not like very much. Alt explained that they needed to prepare many things before taking subjugation requests. Alt also recommended that Dan use that time to rest from that way of life, and they would meet again in that same place 3 days later. Dan was shocked by the fact that he had to wait 3 days. Alt told him that Dan was staying at an inn run by the Hunters Guild, so it would be a good chance for him to meet other hunters, and if he got a little bored, he could take some requests without any problem. If he did not have anyone to do those requests with in 3 days, they could team up, and Alt reminded him that they would always be doing subjugation missions. Dan wanted to go with them, and then the three of them said goodbye to him. Dan saw that that morning had been extremely chaotic. He kept staring at what he had in his hands, which was around 500 crowns. The soup and bread for breakfast that day had cost 3 crowns, and Dan started doing the math on what he had spent the day before, which had been around 25 crowns. He was completely shocked that 20 days at the inn cost more than 1,000 bowls of soup. He hit his forehead against the table, missing his home in an absurd way. He complained to himself because he had been so close to having everything right back home, but instead of that, he was there, completely screwed and stressing out over money. As for the subjugation missions, he knew he needed to prepare. After that, he put on some gear and was stunned by how well it matched him. The saleswoman kept praising him, of course, because she wanted to sell it. That outfit cost 230 crowns, which was very expensive and made him really frustrated. Even so, he ended up buying it, thinking it was a good thing he had not looked at the ones that had iron parts in the armor. Still, he did not know where he should start. Since Dan was broke, he needed to take a request and do some work. Then he went over to a girl with animal ears, winked at her, and explained that he was there to take a job. He had picked a request, and she already knew that he had registered that day, but the job he had chosen was for silver rank, so he could not do it. He needed to look at the ones meant for steel rank. In the end, the first big mission taken by the newest hunter in that place was carrying bags of flour. The second job was cleaning a barn, and the third job was washing clothes that had piled up. That made him very pissed, because he had thought he had become a hunter, but he had really just become a handyman. After that, the sun was setting, and he was completely exhausted. He had worked the whole day, and he could not see any point in becoming a hunter if it was going to be like that. In the end, he had pushed himself hard just to earn 30 crowns. It was basically like living on a paycheck in his original world, and it was completely draining. He felt sad because life was hard no matter where he went. Then he saw saw a man selling skewers, and he started drooling because as a simple working man, he had spent the whole day working, so he decided to eat a few skewers, which ended up taking 3 crowns from him. At least he thought they were delicious. It was even interesting to him because he was simply from another world, a much more modern one, and he was really enjoying the food from that place, even though it was way more primitive. Then a really worn out looking girl came up to him. She had been following him with a magic compass, while Dan was praising the vendor's skewers and wanting to know what the secret was. The girl, who was an elf, pulled on his clothes and declared that she had found her destiny. After they sat down, Dan, feeling a little suspicious, heard from that long-eared elf that he was supposed to be her destined hero. In the end, he wanted to know what proof she had. The long-eared elf declared that her proof was her master's prophecy. The one that Compass pointed to was the hero who would save that world, so she had to help that hero. That was the prophecy her master had left for her. Dan got annoyed and could not understand how she could believe in a prophecy. The elf declared that she believed in it completely, explaining that her master was Drennis, a prophetic witch. Dan wanted to know if that witch was famous or something like that. The crazy girl explained to him that her master's prophecies were never wrong. She even remembered the witch saying it was going to rain because her shoulders were hurting, and it really did rain that day. Meanwhile, Dan thought all of it was boring, and the long-eared girl wanted him to stop committing blasphemy right away. She simply believed blindly in the witch and wanted to force her belief on him. In the end, he still decided to apologize. In the end, Dan wanted to know what could happen if her hero got hunted down or something like that. The elf said that her master Drennis had told her to help the hero no matter what. Her magic would be available to him, no matter what he was doing. Dan did not understand, especially because he had not said anything about what he was going to do to her. The elf was sure that he would save the world, but Dan refused, explaining that his goal was to go back to his original world. The elf did not understand what he meant. In the end, the poor baseball player had no idea who that long-eared girl was, who her master was, or what the hell she meant by calling him the hero. So he made it very clear that he had no intention of saving that world. He had more reasons than he could count to go back home as soon as possible. Then he left the table, warning her that she should look for someone else, because it was not him. The elf looked blank in that moment. Mary, annoying as hell, was already starting to bother the long-eared elf after seeing that she had been rejected, calling her a poor thing. Briand quickly warned her that she should stop getting involved in other people's lives, and since she had free time, she should help him. But Mary, being awful and clever, made the excuse that other people's love lives were very fun and that she liked watching them. She thought the long-eared girl was trying to date Dan. Briand, either way, could not believe that he was the one taking care of all the paperwork, even though he was the leader of the group, while she was relaxing and entertaining herself like that. The cursed blonde still made it clear, pointing her finger at him, that this was what he existed for, because in her mind, nobles had much more important duties. Briand started thinking about that disciple of Drennis, the prophetic witch. That was interesting information to him. Then the scene changed to the elf remembering everything that had happened, with the witch telling her to take the magic compass. The witch told her that the magic tool would lead her to her destiny. The long-eared elf, named Ariel, cried. She was very worried and ended up being teleported toward her destiny. Then the scene changed to Dan, completely worn out, throwing some bags of flour onto the ground. He sighed and was sweating a lot, while an old woman said he had worked very well that day. Then he went to talk with her, while Ariel watched from far away. She understood what he had been doing all day, because he had only been working. The old woman had liked Dan's work so much that she ended up paying him a little extra. Ariel quickly saw that he was out of money. She was not sure if he really was the destiny her master had told her about. Since Ariel no longer had Drennis, she had no idea what she could do in that moment. Then Dan appeared and wanted to know what she was doing there, and if she was going to keep following him the whole day. He told her to go back to her master or whatever, because he did not even know her. Dan repeated that he was not the so-called gifted hero, and Ariel explained that her master had passed away. That was something Dan had not expected. It caught him by surprise, and he quickly wanted to apologize to the long-eared girl, because he felt like he had been a little insensitive with her. Ariel, knowing that he wanted to return to his original world, declared that she was willing to help him. She did not care if he only wanted to go back home or keep cleaning barns. She would help him. Then the scene changed to Alt putting on his armor. Celis arrived and told him that Dan might have left because she had not found him at the inn. Alt thought that was very strange. Then Mary butted in again, assuming that Dan had run far away. She kept bringing up the fact that Dan had killed a wyvern with just one hit. She even accused him of bragging, being a damn liar because he had not done that. She believed he was scared that people would find out the truth. Alt saw that Mary was armed too, and did not understand what was going on. Mary noticed that Alt had not heard about the reports of monsters appearing near Shiltrock, and that they were the kind of monsters that did not live around there. Because of that, her group, the oppressive nobles, had taken on the task of searching the area near the domain. She used the example that they would supervise and protect a group with half the strength of beginner hunters. Alt was not going to tolerate anyone looking down on him and Celis. He also was not willing to stand still while that damn girl insulted Dan. Veronica, who was part of the oppressive nobles group and had horns, wanted to know who Dan was. Before Before Brienne could explain, Sayla started shouting that Dan had saved their lives, and she was not willing to keep listening to that crap either. And Mary, as always, commented that she had last seen him looking busy while flirting. Celis did not understand anything, while Mary kept running her mouth non-stop, explaining that an elf had shown up and started talking about destiny around Dan. She thought the two of them had gotten completely lost in their little romance, and that he had ended up forgetting everyone in the group. But Celis got very close to Mary with a psycho look in her eyes, and declared that she was a damn liar. Mary did not understand anything. Celis, looking completely crazy, explained that Dan had come from another world and only knew them there, but then suddenly, he had a girl with him. In the end, Celis thought Mary should at least make her lies sound possible, because she, in particular, was already sick of it. And honestly, it was not hard to hate that blonde. Then Dan's voice came up, wanting to know who had said he ran away, and Mary was stunned. Celis had gotten inside her head. Brienne only watched as Dan arrived with Ariel, and he greeted everyone, since it had already been a few days since they had seen each other. Alt was happy to see Dan there, while Dan hoped he was not late. Mary was completely frustrated, because Dan had shut her mouth in the best way possible in that moment. Then she pointed her finger at Dan, calling him a traitor, and Dan just stared blankly, because that Mary was unbearable. Mary accused him of being a traitor because they were going to form a group together, but he had gone and teamed up with someone else. Celis stayed quiet with her energy around her body, and Alt did the same, while Mary kept going, accusing Dan of being a shameless and cold-blooded traitor. Meanwhile, Dan still did not understand why she was getting into other people's business again. Alt made it clear to him that he was not forcing Dan, but he also had not expected that. After all, there was an elf mage standing right in front of them, out of all things. Alt wanted to understand how they had met. In the end, Dan said it was a long story, and Ariel explained that she had searched for Dan, saying that destiny had guided her to him. That made Dan embarrassed, and it was not just him. Mary was left with her mouth open, and so was Alt. Celis kept her weird stare. Dan got pissed because the long-eared elf had made it sound strange on purpose, while Brienne believed it was a top-tier romance. Then Alt wanted to know the elf's name, and she introduced herself, so Alt wanted to know if she was going to join the subjugation mission with them, and Ariel confirmed it, explaining that she was only interested in helping Dan. She had even gotten a hunter badge the day before because of it. Brienne was shocked, seeing a devoted wife in the making, and Veronica, the horned girl, also declared that it was pure and devoted love. Alt said that Alyosha's wounds had still not fully healed, so she would not take part that time. Because of that, having more people with them would be much better. Dan wanted to apologize to Alt for deciding that without telling him first, but Alt did not care. He said that since everyone was together, they could move forward, and what that bunch of rookies was going to hunt were goblins. A goblin was a small monster with the mind of a little child. They were aggressive and usually used crude tools. They attacked places where humans lived, stealing livestock and valuable items. One single goblin was nothing. The problem was that those little bastards moved in groups. Alt explained to his comrades that there had been many reports of small villages being attacked by goblins. Last time, they had been ambushed by a wyvern, and then Dan had shown up and saved them. Dan understood what Alt was saying, but he did not understand why the oppressive nobles were going with them. In the end, it seemed like monsters were multiplying more and more around Shiltrock, so the oppressive nobles were there to investigate the anomaly. Mary, that piece of trash, still thought Dan should feel honored to be walking with them, warning him that she was there to protect them. But it was impossible to take that unbearable girl seriously, because she was wearing a princess-like outfit, looking like she was going for a stroll. Dan could not believe it had to be her. Alt understood why Dan was not very happy, but he made it clear that the oppressive nobles were a pretty famous party. They were only in their second year, but they had risen to silver rank in just 1 year. Those unbearable bastards were even candidates to reach gold rank. Dan could not believe it. Meanwhile, Mary wanted to know if Ariel was a real elf, and even asked where she was from. Even Ariel could not stand it anymore. Alt admitted that the oppressive nobles were very flashy, and Dan was dying to slap Mary on the head when she called Ariel a dwarf. Then Alt told Dan that they needed to get the job done, explaining that he used blunt weapons, so he would stay on the front line. Celis and Ariel would take care of the back line. Alt also wanted to know what kind of magic Ariel used, but the long-eared girl did not understand what he meant. Alt realized that his question had been vague. He explained that even though he was not a specialist, he had heard that magic had some major categories, like destruction, enhancement, alchemy, summoning, and necromancy. In the end, there were many types. Veronica, the horned one, for example, specialized in enhancement magic. Most mages had a main specialty, so it would be good for them to plan in the best way possible. Alt admitted that it was their first time working with a mage, because normally, mages were silver rank or higher. Ariel finally managed to understand, until suddenly, an arrow flew toward her, right in the middle of her face. Dan managed to catch the arrow before the long-eared girl got hurt. That surprised everyone, and in the end, it had been a goblin who had done it. Brienne saw that it was a goblin ambush. Mary, nosy as always, shoved her hand in Brienne's face and declared that they did not need to step in. She wanted to leave it to the hunters so they could do their job. But in truth, the gossip only wanted to see how Dan fought. One of the goblins rushed toward them, and Dan quickly knocked it down with his baseball bat, which basically massaged the goblin's face. After that, they quickly took down all the goblins in the area. Dan got excited because it had been easier than he expected. Alt praised Dan's work, liking his skills a lot, while Celis thought something was strange, because goblins were not the type to ambush armed hunters like that. Normally, they ended up setting ambushes for those who were weaker, like children and the elderly. That was the strategy of those creatures, and in the end, they had shot at Ariel, a mage, before anyone else. Alt assumed they needed to find the goblin's nest and end everything once and for all, sure that those were not the only goblins around. Meanwhile, that crappy group of oppressive nobles just stood there watching, while Dan assumed they should have left one of the goblins alive. So he wanted to know if they should keep going deeper, but everyone kept looking at him, really scared. He wanted to know what the nest looked like, and after seeing everyone's faces, he thought they were judging him for his questions. Even Ariel had her eyes wide open, along with Mary. Behind him, while he understood nothing, there was a huge red monster, so Dan wanted to know if he had done something wrong. Alt, completely desperate, told Dan to be careful because there was something behind him. Dan did not understand anything, and when he was turning around, the monster already tried to attack him. Mary, all of a sudden, managed to block that attack, showing that even though she was wearing princess clothes, she was not that useless. Dan and Alt were surprised by her speed. Then Brienne told Dan to step back, declaring that they would handle the rest. Dan just watched as Brienne explained that they had found a rock mountain troll, so he was sure something really was going on. Mary wanted nobody to lower their guard, making it clear that this opponent would not go down that easily. Dan declared that he also wanted to join the fight, but Alt refused, judging that they would only get in the way of the oppressive nobles. Alt recognized Dan's strength, but the oppressive nobles were an experienced party. Because of that, Alt thought it was much more likely that they would get in the oppressive nobles' way than actually help them, so he would trust those guys' strength. Dan did not like what he heard very much, and everyone just kept watching. Brienne called Veronica, and she focused, using her battle spirit enhancement magic. Very quickly, the three members of her group became stronger. Alt was surprised by what she had just done. Then the troll started moving very fast, going toward Mary. She immediately put her shield in front of her, and she even managed to hold back the monster's attack, even though she struggled a little. The dwarf quickly fired a shot with her crossbow, and Brienne moved together with the arrow, hitting the troll right in the eye. Then he asked Mary to give him a boost, using her shield to jump, and he struck the troll's other eye with his dagger. The troll screamed a lot while its eye bled heavily. Dan was surprised, and thought those people were amazing, because each member moved like part of one single body. They looked like a real team that had trained that formation hundreds of times. The troll's vision was completely ruined, but Brienne assumed the wounds were shallow. With the regeneration the troll had, it would be able to recover very fast. But since the troll was fighting them without using any magic attacks, it was the worst possible matchup. Mary knew they needed to aim for the heart, which was the source of the troll's regeneration, so she told Veronica to get ready. The oppressive nobles really were known as a complete group, with perfect coordination and solid positioning, but they had one fatal flaw, and that was their firepower. Aaron's crossbow reloaded slowly and did not cause much damage to large monsters. Brienne shared the frontal attack with Mary, using two short daggers, which also were not good against large monsters. It was not ideal, and Veronica, the only mage in the group, could not use anything besides enhancement magic, so they could not really count on her for attacks. Mary, the one who stayed on the front line, used a unique weapon, a lance. The lance was made for mounted combat, with its balance shifted backward, so a fighter on foot with limited mobility could not truly release its full power. The oppressive nobles made up for that in a very unusual way, pouring extreme and focused enhancement into one single person. Veronica simply used strength boost, speed boost, and endurance boost only on Mary. She turned into a kind of heavy infantry, a real machine filled with buffs. Because of that, she reached a speed that surpassed cavalry. She rushed toward that troll with insane speed. Celis was left with her mouth open, while Ariel showed no reaction at all. And that was why Mary had earned a nickname at the Hunters Guild. She was known as the Golden Unicorn. She simply caused a huge hit on that troll and still had a smile on her face. Dan was surprised by her skill, and Alt was left speechless. That was when Mary declared that a troll was nothing before her, making it very clear that this was what her group was. But her arrogance ended in 1 second. That walking piece of trash started coughing up blood. Alt still found himself willing to worry about Mary. Brienne ran desperately to his lady while she was coughing up a lot of blood. He had already told her that method demanded too much from her body, but that idiot only thought a noble had to set an example for others, and that it was nothing. In that moment, she judged that they should go back and ask for reinforcements, until, in a very satisfying way, she ended up taking an arrow to the chest. That left Brienne with a 1,000-yard stare. The idiot did not understand anything, and she quickly fell to her knees, doing everything she could not to pass out. Then several monsters appeared. It was not just one troll, there were many of them around. In all his life, Brienne had never seen anything like that. Alt had no idea where that legion of monsters had come from. Mary quickly shouted for Veronica. Veronica, and Veronica realized what she meant. Mary wanted them to take Aaron and the others away, because she would buy time for all of them. Aaron was worried about Mary, and so was Brienne. Mary already knew what he was going to say to her, but she did not want to hear it. She made it very clear that in that moment, she had to fulfill her duty as a noble, even when she was already close to dying. She was unbearable. Brienne was left speechless in that moment, while Dan thought Mary was being way too dramatic. He warned her that there was a limit to how much she could look down on people, making it very clear that they were not going to run away and leave her behind. What Dan said surprised everyone. Mary wanted him to stop being stubborn and leave, especially because he had just witnessed the fight they had. She also assumed that with the fragile weapon he had, he would not be able to hurt a troll, showing that she knew absolutely nothing. She also believed that even if he somehow got lucky enough to kill one troll, he would still have to deal with several more of them. But Dan was not that worried, because compared to the monsters he had faced together with Ares, those did not seem like a big deal. Mary got really irritated and wanted him to stop talking nonsense and leave quickly, because she no longer had time to deal with that conversation. Then, all of a sudden, a troll got ready to hit her from behind. Mary was screwed, because she had no time to do anything. Dan then showed her what real power looked like, rushing toward the troll and pretty much making it lose its arm, which was completely crushed by Dan's baseball bat, leaving Mary and Brienne speechless. The troll was dying from pain, because losing a limb was not easy. That was when Dan wanted to know what the veteran hunter had planned. Mary stared at him with a dumb look on her face, while he felt very confident. He made it clear that everyone was waiting for her plan, and really, everyone was ready to fight. Alt stated that his group would fight with Mary. Aaron also did not see anything genuine in someone who abandoned their companions. Mary was completely stunned. Dan had shown her what he was made of. In the end, she asked Brienne and Celis to fight the goblins. Since there were many trolls, they would have to deal with them one by one. Dan would knock the trolls down each time, while the others would keep them distracted. However, Ariel wanted them to wait a little, declaring that she would handle it. Dan wanted to know if she had a plan. The long-eared mage started to smile. She remembered very well that Alt had asked what kind of magic she specialized in, so she explained that she did not have a specialty in any kind of magic. There was no magic she could not use. Then she used her mana boost, focus boost, and elemental boost abilities. Soon she began to levitate, and she prepared a magic attack called Irresistible Dragon Flame, launching a wicked blast of fire toward all those monsters. She simply turned the monsters into barbecue and casually started a forest fire for free. Dan's eyes went wide. He had no idea that the long-eared elf was on that level. Smiling and showing that everything was under control, Ariel said it was all done. Mary started laughing, saying that the whole thing was absurd, and then she passed out, leaving her team very worried. After that, the scene changed to Mary waking up. She had a deadly poison in her body, a rare toxin that was not seen often. The doctor told Brienne that he had done everything he could in that moment, but if they did not find an antidote soon, her life could no longer be guaranteed. Brienne understood that very well. Dan still hoped Mary would be okay. Since she was a noble, he assumed she was being treated in some mansion. He ended up looking down on that inn, and Aaron explained that Mary was no longer a noble, which left him confused. After all, her group kept calling her lady all the time. Aaron explained that Mary had been born a noble, and that she had been Mary's attendant, but all of that was in the past. Then the scene changed to Brienne. He was trapped inside a carriage used to transport prisoners, and a bunch of guards were taking them away. He was not alone. There were other guys there, and they wanted to know what each person had done to end up there. But Brienne simply ignored all of them. When the guy saw that he did not want to talk, he let it go. Either way, the prisoners had already accepted that it was the end of the line for them. All of them were going to be executed. The guards were bored, and they did not like the idea of having to move a bunch of prisoners around just to kill them, thinking it would be much easier to kill them where they had found them. It was all just a big show. At the same time, Brienne felt that there was not a single real criminal from the capital in that place. The guards got pissed. In the end, it was more than clear to everyone there that the government did not even have the resources for trials, so they had gathered all the prisoners at once to deal with everything in one go. Then, suddenly, one of the guards was hit by an arrow that pierced through his neck, and they were being ambushed. Those guards wore red clothes, while some guards in blue cloaks watched all the movement from above. Very quickly, those blue-cloaked guards took down all the red-clothed guards. The lord of those blue guards was there on his horse. His guards wanted to know what they should do with those people, and since they were criminals, the lord's son, who was also on his horse beside him, assumed that all of them should be executed right there. The men trembled a lot, while Brienne stayed calm. Then the lord took off his helmet and wanted to know what crimes Brienne had committed. Some men grew desperate, trying to say that they were only low-level thieves and were not even worth being killed. The man who said that ended up getting hit by the lord, who made him lose his head. The other one, who was still alive, was terrified, while Brienne did not say a single word and did not show any reaction at all. When that lord saw the boy, he felt like Brienne seemed like an extinguished candle. Even though he was so young, he wanted to know if Brienne had no attachment to life, not even enough to say what his crime was. was. Briand made it clear to that lord that if he wanted to take his life, he should hurry up and do it already. He also questioned whether the lord was afraid of killing a child for no reason. The lord's son could not believe that someone had spoken to his father that way. However, the lord liked Briand's courage, and because of that, he saw Briand as the perfect gift for his youngest daughter, so he gave the order to put the boy inside the wagon. His son seemed reluctant about that decision, while Briand could not believe he had become a slave, realizing that his life was complete trash. Then the scene changed to him taking a hot bath. He had no idea what kind of hell was about to come into his life, and he remembered when he had arrived at the place, and a maid had not liked his smell at all. To her, he smelled like a wet dog, and there was no way he could live around everyone like that. He needed to take a bath right away, so Briand stayed in that hot water, thinking that a slave had just been given a bath, and for him that was actually something pretty luxurious. Briand assumed it had to feel nice to have money to burn. At the same time, he thought that Lord was very brave, because he was trusting his daughter's life to a criminal, but he still had not seen what she was like. Then the scene changed to a guard making it very clear that he should not do anything disrespectful to the young lady. The guard warned him that any kind of stunt he tried would cost him his life, but Briand did not care, and he was even annoyed that those guys would not shut up. Then the girl came to him, and she was Mary, calling Briand the gift her father had prepared for her. Her name was Mary Chatillon, and Briand quickly realized she was a small girl. She remembered her father saying that he had found him on the road, and she saw that Briand was exactly like her father had said, messy and completely without refinement. He was getting deeply irritated with her. In the end, Mary declared that since he was a gift her father had prepared, she would take care of him very carefully. Briand just watched her, until she wanted to know his name, and he said it was Jared. She did not like it at all, and thought it sounded very awkward. Meanwhile, he assumed that girl was strangely good at annoying people. He could not believe he was going to spend his life serving that brat. He would rather die than live through that kind of thing, and it was at that moment that Mary ended up renaming him, calling Jared Briand. He did not understand anything, while she made it clear that this would be his name from that day on. She held out her hand to him, declaring that she was counting on him, and Briand thought his new name was really annoying. Then the scene changed to Briand working as a slave, wiping things down with a cloth. He thought about how people said humans were creatures that could adapt. Instead of stealing or robbing people in the street, he was now spending his days doing housework he had never done before. Instead of stuffing his face with stolen food or half-rotten scraps just to survive, he was eating warm meals that were prepared for him. Even the maids treated him very well. Instead of holding a grudge against him or wanting to kill him, Briand suddenly found himself surrounded by people full of kindness and goodwill. He remembered a maid wanting to know if he needed help with the garden. He had been living that kind of life for a few months, but it felt so easy and natural to him that it was almost like he had lived his whole life that way. While he was doing his chores, the maid wanted to know if he was managing well, but he said he could not complain. Then she placed her hand on his forehead, making it clear that he looked better when his forehead was showing, which made him embarrassed. He turned his face away because he had gone red. He wanted to understand what was wrong with her. If there was one thing that was a little troublesome about that new life, it was Mary herself. He heard her screaming his name, and he quickly went to answer her. Mary, with a dumb look on her face, declared that she wanted sweets. He simply hated the fact that she was always calling him. He did not understand anything, because she could just ask the maids to bring them to her, but she explained that her mother had said she could not eat sweets, so the maids would not listen to her. So he started sighing. He quickly brought a bunch of sweets to her, and she ate them with absurd happiness, thanking him for what he had done. He had passed through strict security to bring those sweets, and she thought that maybe he had been a legendary thief before coming to her. He simply looked away, and that was how he stopped being Jared, nothing more than a street rat. Then the scene changed to him hearing someone calling him. While he was working in the garden, he looked back, and Mary was already older. She told him that her father had returned from the campaign. He smiled and declared that he had been waiting to hear that kind of news. Then the lord who had taken him in before made it clear that he had returned home. His name was Leslie Chatillon, and his wife Catherine Chatillon welcomed him back. Leslie was very happy to have arrived home, until he heard someone screaming and calling for him. It was Mary, who was very happy to see her father. He looked silly seeing how much his little daughter had grown, almost not recognizing her. In that moment, Briand was bowing before his lord. Her father wanted to know if he was the only one she was happy to see, and then Mary was caught by surprise. Her older brothers were there too. The oldest son of the Chatillon family was named Leon, and he saw that his sister had really grown a lot. But to the other brother, the middle one, she had not grown that much, because she was still only up to his chest. His name was Reynold, and he started messing with her, wanting to know how she had spent all that time. While she got really irritated because he was messing up her hair, Leon went over to Briand to thank him for taking care of his little sister all that time. Briand was surprised. In the end, Leslie wanted them to have a meal together, because it had been a while since they had all been together. The scene changed to the whole family sitting at the table. Leslie was very happy and eating, and Mary was glowing too. Briand really liked that atmosphere. After the Chatillon family finished eating, Leslie collected the plates, until Lord Leslie called the young man, explaining that he wanted to talk with him. Then the scene changed to outside, where it had already gotten dark. Leslie saw that 5 years had already passed since Briand had arrived there, so Lord Chatillon wanted to know if Briand had been able to live comfortably. Briand admitted that he was living so well that he could not ask for anything more. Leslie could see that from the young man's face, because he looked nothing like the walking corpse he had seen 5 years earlier. Briand knew that all of it was thanks to his lord, because he had basically given life back to a dead man. He had also given Briand a reason to keep living, and Leslie, talking about the life Briand owed him, wanted to know how the young man could spend it for him. That left Briand very scared in that moment. Suddenly, several horses appeared at the palace, and many men with torches were there. A war was about to happen. That bastard Leslie already knew what was coming, so Briand went as desperately as possible to his lady. Mary was sleeping at that moment and did not understand what he was doing at that hour. Shouting, he declared that she needed to get out of there immediately. While she did not understand why he was saying that so suddenly, Leslie was looking at his enemy Geoffrey with great anger, seeing that he had really managed to do it. Geoffrey had already told him before, making it very clear that this was the only way they could survive. Geoffrey was the president of the Central Association of Nobles of the Kingdom, and he was from the Lutz family. Mary's older brothers were there with swords in their hands. Leslie was furious at Geoffrey for saying that this was the only way they could survive, because he was betraying his own ruler and becoming the Empire's dog. Geoffrey respected the fact that Leslie had chosen to keep his loyalty until the end, but he assumed that not everyone could choose a glorious death like Leslie's. Then the scene changed to Briand running desperately while holding Mary's hand. She did not understand where they were going, but he had no time to explain. His only mission was to get her out of there immediately. Then the scene changed to a little before everything happened. Leslie explained to Briand that soon a storm of blood would sweep through that place. And when that moment came, he had a favor to ask of Briand, which was to take care of his youngest daughter, Mary. In the end, Briand promised he would fulfill his duty, while Leslie himself would fulfill his own duty. At the same time, Leslie could not believe Geoffrey would try to trap him with so few soldiers. However, Geoffrey was not willing to face the strongest man in the Central Kingdom empty-handed, and Leslie was shocked because Geoffrey had brought the Zodiac from the capital. He was furious that Geoffrey had brought enemy commanders into the royal capital. Quickly, the scene changed to that palace being swallowed by fire, where even the maids were losing their lives. Mary was shocked by the terrifying scene she was seeing. Meanwhile, Briand explained to his reluctant lady that they needed to leave right then. He shook her, explaining that they had no time, so he wanted her to try to save herself. She still did not understand anything, until he reached the stable and wanted to know if Linda had already prepared the horses. But unfortunately for him, there was a man there, holding a sword in his hand. And Linda, a poor maid, had a huge cut across her chest. Briand's eyes went wide, and that man declared that everything had gone perfectly, because every moment had lined up just right. He did not want the two of them to be afraid, because he promised to end both of their lives before they could feel anything. Then, all of a sudden, Reynald tried to attack that man, who managed to duck at the right moment. Reynald also had a sword in his hands, and he told Briand to take his sister away quickly. Briand did not want to leave Reynald alone, while Mary's second brother ordered the two of them to leave immediately. Briand ran desperately, while Mary cried a lot, because she did not want to leave her brother there. At that moment, the man declared that they had been told to catch some small fish trying to escape, and he was getting irritated. The Chatillon family was showing a lot of luck, and he knew the second son of the Chatillon house, Reynald, very well. He had never imagined he would get the chance to cross swords with Reynald, and Reynald, the second son of the Chatillon house, had also heard of that man, whose name was Hugo Fagerty, and that was how Briand ended up riding away on horseback with Mary. The poor girl cried a lot while that palace was being completely destroyed. Then the scene changed back to the present. Briand was not okay, until Alt arrived desperately, saying they had a report from the guild. Briand was surprised by that news. Alt said they had found traces of magic on the monsters' corpses, and it was probably the work of monster tamers on vacation. Briand heard that and appeared from above, drawing everyone's attention. Aaron wanted to know what the doctor had said about Mary's condition, but Briand called Dan and Ariel, completely ignoring the dwarf, declaring that he needed help from the two of them. Then the scene suddenly changed. Aquinos was smiling, even though she thought everything was very strange, because she had certainly provided money, manpower, monsters, and poison until the perfect moment. There was a man visibly shocked in front of her. In the end, Aquinos assumed she had provided everything, so she wanted to understand how he had failed. The man apologized desperately, explaining that a mage had suddenly interfered. He begged Aquinos for one more chance while trembling a lot. Around them, there were several bodies, because Aquinos had simply slaughtered all those people. She thought about what chance she could give that man, until she reached the conclusion that she had already given enough chances. She kept smiling. In the end, Hugo Fagerty was with her, and wanted to know what she was planning to do. He also wanted to know if she was going to give up on Shiltrock just like that. However, Aquinos did not see what she could do, because ever since the surprise attack had ended in failure, security inside the territory had become even tighter. The Hunters Guild had also stepped up its investigation. She was also worried that the guild would realize she had done something on her own, and above all, she did not want to irritate Asclepius. In a way, it was something she had started kind of of as a joke, so she told Hugo that she was going back at that moment. Meanwhile, Hugo still had some things to do there, something he had not been able to settle for a long time, which was marry herself. Then the scene changed to a guy taking a huge punch to the face and dropping hard to the ground. Briand was the one who had thrown that punch, declaring that he was not in a good mood, so he was warning him ahead of time. He wanted that guy to tell the truth, showing an absurd killing intent, while Dan only watched. Ariel was also with them. While the man explained to Briand that he really did not know anything, because he had not seen any beast tamers or trolls, Briand refused to believe him. He knew those guys were aware of everything that entered and left that area, so there was no way they had not seen monsters and mages on that scale. Robbing people was something those guys did, and they would not let something like that pass by so easily. Briand pointed his dagger at him, while the man declared that he really did not know and had no reason to lie. Briand knew there was no way for him to know what went on inside the mind of trash like that guy, and when he was about to attack the man with the dagger, Dan made him stop, asking if that was not enough already. He reminded Briand that he was there to help him find an antidote for Mary. He had no intention of helping Briand oppress or kill anyone. Briand then made him let go of his hand and made it very clear to Dan that he would not need to dirty his own hands. But to Dan, standing by and watching was no different from killing. Briand stopped to think for a moment and ended up being convinced by Dan, telling that man to leave. The man ran away like a madman, with his arms still tied. Briand hoped Dan was satisfied in that moment. He still blamed Dan, because the chance of finding a beast tamer had gone down even more. Dan did not understand anything. Briand believed those guys had the antidote. Then he started getting more and more pissed, declaring that Dan was hiding behind his hypocrisy while Mary was slowly dying. Ariel watched Briand yell at Dan in that moment. Then she used her magic and told the two of them that she had found it. Obviously, both of them were confused, especially because she had spent most of her time there in silence. She said she had found it by using magic nearby. Then the scene changed to them walking. Ariel was very tired, breathing hard like she had just run a marathon. Dan thought her stamina was terrible. Ariel could not even hide it. She admitted that she was completely worn out and asked them to go on ahead, so Briand declared that he was moving forward. Dan could not believe he was going to leave the two of them there alone, and Briand explained that he had no time to waste. Seeing that Ariel was struggling, Dan suggested carrying her. However, when he looked toward that strange elf, she had simply vanished from that place, leaving him completely confused. Dan was stunned. The scene changed to Hugo Fagerty, looking at his reflection in the blade. He had not expected to find the person he wanted so much. After all, he had been searching since that time, and he felt lucky that this moment had finally come. Then the scene changed to the strange long-eared elf. She was walking and seemed very upset because she was completely lost. In the end, it had made no sense at all for her to leave Dan's side. Ariel thought that this was her usual problem, so she needed to find Dan right away. Then she heard a noise in the bushes and looked toward where the sound had come from. After that, the scene changed to Briand coming out of the woods. He was shocked by who he had found. It was Hugo Fagerty, sitting there with a blade in his hands. Briand was stunned by that man's presence, and Hugo wanted to know if Briand had flown there. He had never expected someone to live while searching for him. Briand's hand was shaking in that moment, while Hugo did not even care. Briand saw some bodies around. There was blood everywhere, and Briand wanted to know if Hugo had done that. He was also talking about whether Hugo had ordered the beast tamers to invade that place, and whether he had also killed all the beast tamers there. Hugo did not understand whether that mattered, because to him, it really looked like Briand was desperate enough to kill him. His words truly affected Briand. Either way, Hugo accepted that calmly, because to him, it was normal to want to kill someone, and he smiled while saying it. Then the scene changed to Dan, who was looking for Ariel and shouting her name. He hoped she would answer if she could hear him. At the same time, he felt very frustrated, because in that brief moment when she had disappeared, it had really seemed to him that she was surprisingly absent-minded. He was also worried about Briand going off alone, because if he had to fight a beast tamer or something like that, he would be by himself. Dan was very irritated with that situation. It was becoming a huge headache. Then the scene changed to Briand, who was fighting Hugo, trying to hit him with his dagger in every possible way, until he was struck directly and his blood fell onto the ground. It was in that moment that Hugo remembered perfectly that Briand was the servant of the brat from the Chatillon family. Hugo declared that he had a very good memory. He had heard that Mary had been poisoned, and if that was the case, he was sure Briand was searching for something that was right in his hands. Then he showed the antidote. He told Briand that this was the perfect chance for him to save that young lady's life, and get revenge too, imagining that Briand had to be very excited. But in truth, the young man was completely shocked. Hugo told him not to be in such a hurry, and he still mocked Briand, saying that he would not want to see Mary, who had survived all that chaos, die because of poison spread on a goblin arrow. To Hugo, that would be extremely boring. Briand became furious after hearing that and rushed toward that bastard, even after taking an attack that made him bleed a lot. Hugo admired Briand's loyalty and courage. In the end, he saw that Briand also did not understand the word limits, and he was going to put him in his place. Briand tried to wound Hugo with his dagger, but Hugo made him drop it. The dagger fell and stuck into the ground. ground. Hugo wanted to know if Brienne truly believed he could face him with such a cheap toy. Brienne's hand was shaking a lot in that moment. He had forgotten for a moment, because he had gotten so angry. He had forgotten just how strong that man was. Hugo Fagerty was a former helper of White Aries, one of the 12 signs of the Zodiac, which was the strongest night order in the Empire. Hugo carried the unusual nickname Pervert. He had that strange nickname because of his fanatical obsession with duels. It was something out of the ordinary. Even on battlefields where victory was already guaranteed, he would still do anything to get involved in a life-or-death duel against the enemy commander to decide the result. The fact that he was still alive showed Brienne that Hugo had never lost a duel, and that scared him. Hugo wanted to know what was wrong, and he also wanted to know where all that courage Brienne had a few minutes ago had gone. Then he decided to tell a story to give Brienne some motivation, since he was completely stunned in that moment. Hugo explained that the scar on his left eye was the work of Reynold Chatillon, who had stepped forward to save him and Mary that day. The House of the Knights of the Central Kingdom had truly lived up to its name, with a skill that was honestly exceptional. Hugo declared that it had been a duel of unmatched excellence, and he vividly remembered the look in Reynold Chatillon's eyes when his sword pierced his heart. He watched the young man's gaze slowly fade away, and Hugo hated the fact that he had witnessed all of that alone. Because of that, he declared that as soon as he killed Brienne there, he would go straight to the village and tell Mary, in detail, everything that had happened back then. Right after that, Hugo would give her the antidote so he could challenge her to a duel. He kept thinking about a small young lady coming at him with a lot of rage, and he would carve her up like he was shaping a work of art in the slowest and most painful way possible. He laughed like a psychopath while saying that, certain that it would truly be a lot of fun. Brienne refused to accept it and made it very clear to that man that it would not happen. He would kill Hugo right there. Then he showed a speed he had not shown before, rushing toward Hugo, who stood still while waiting for the attack. Hugo dodged it easily, then landed a strike on Brienne's back. Even so, Brienne tried to hit him with his own hands. Hugo dodged again and managed to counterattack, cutting his leg. Brienne wanted to understand what Hugo thought he was doing. For Hugo, he was only making sure Brienne's muscles grew weaker and weaker. That made Mary's servant very angry, and he started cursing at Hugo, but Hugo did not want him to worry, saying that he was already starting to get tired anyway. Then he made his next move, hitting Brienne hard in the chest and making him bleed a lot. In that moment, Brienne started asking himself if that was as far as he could go. Then the scene changed to a rabbit in that forest. Ariel was looking at some huge footprints, trying to understand what kind of creature had left those tracks. The trail was leading to Shiltrock, so she really did not know if it was another monster from a beast tamer. But at the same time, she assumed it would be fine, since there were soldiers and hunters in the territory. She needed to find Dan, and fast. But that crazy girl ended up deciding that she should take care of the monsters first and then regroup. She got that idea in her head because she was lost, thinking she would not find him that quickly. Then the scene changed back to Brienne, who was on the ground in that moment. Hugo admitted to the young man that his determination was impressive, even though he thought he was more reckless than brave. Either way, it was no longer fun for Hugo to keep oppressing him, so he decided to end Brienne's suffering. In that moment, Brienne recognized that he had been careless. He knew how huge the gap between the two of them was. Even so, he had rushed in without thinking of a plan. Brienne had been blinded by rage, doing something he normally would not do. Deep down, he had always known that against that bastard, he was not even worthy of being considered an opponent. What truly made him angry was not the enemy right in front of him. What made Brienne furious was his own weakness, and the fact that he felt unable to protect anyone. In that moment, Hugo Fagerty said goodbye to him, but before he could finish Brienne off, he was hit by a rock, interrupting everything. The one responsible for that beautiful throw was Dan himself, who had arrived at the right time. Hugo wanted to understand what the hell was going on, and Dan made it clear that he should be the one asking that. He wanted to know who Hugo thought he was, believing he could kill Brienne. When Brienne saw that Dan had arrived, he told him to run. Then that bastard Hugo gave him a heavy kick, making him roll away. Dan became even more worried about Brienne, while Hugo was furious with Dan for interrupting the duel, something sacred to him. Dan did not understand what the hell he was hearing, until he was suddenly surprised. Hugo rushed at him with his sword, and Dan managed to dodge. That also caught Hugo by surprise. He had not expected the young man to dodge. Dan declared that it had been way too sudden, and then he decided to attack. The clash between his baseball bat and the sword created a huge impact. Hugo was completely stunned by everything he was seeing. The impact was so strong that it dragged him several meters across the ground, even tearing up the soil. He assumed Dan was using magic. He really could not believe that kind of power was only raw strength. His hand was already shaking. Dan did not like the fact that Hugo had rushed at him, trying to kill him without saying a word, so he saw that the situation was not normal. Hugo declared Dan a strange guy with a weapon that had bizarre power, and he recognized that Brienne had made a very unusual friend. Hugo was already starting to get excited, and with that psychotic way of his, he wanted to see what Dan was capable of. He rushed toward Dan, trying to hit the young man in every possible way. Dan managed to dodge, but it was not that simple for him. Hugo Fagerty increased the speed of his attacks even more, and somehow, Dan was managing to keep up with it. That left Hugo confused. He kept kept wondering who the hell that guy was, because his reaction speed was out of the ordinary. It was so fast that Hugo ended up being surprised. Dan had almost hit him. Hugo saw that it was not just reaction speed. He managed to block, but Dan's strength was brutal, making him tear up the ground again. Hugo quickly noticed that the real danger in fighting Dan was his insane raw strength. If he got hit by one of those blows, he was sure he would die immediately. But Hugo was insane. Even knowing that, he smiled, because it had been a long time since he had a fight where his life was truly at risk, and that made him even happier. Dan was really scared by the look on Hugo's face, because he looked like a complete psychopath. He quickly felt the atmosphere change. Hugo started moving in a very strange way, heading toward Dan while asking him not to disappoint him. In that moment, Dan's eyes went wide, and he was hit with everything right in the chest. In baseball, one thing that mattered a lot was dynamic visual sharpness, the ability to track moving objects with speed and precision. For baseball players, that was without a doubt a crucial skill. Kim Dan was known as a player outside the norm, and everyone in his town recognized him for his pitches. The time he took to read whether a pitch was a strike or a ball was around 0.15 seconds, and that was exactly why he could not understand it. In Dan's eyes, that path was clearly a ball, so he ended up getting hit, but it was not a full hit because his baseball bat had protected the middle of his body. Hugo truly thought it was impressive that Dan had reacted in a fraction of a second to avoid a fatal blow. That was definitely more than Hugo had expected. Dan held his wound and judged that he did not even need to exchange many blows to be sure. Hugo's technique and experience were completely overwhelming, so he no longer knew if he could win a duel against that monster. Then the scene went back in time to when he was still in his original world. He dropped his bat and was very upset because he had taken another strike. Then the coach came over and told Dan not to be like that, declaring that he had not played badly. The problem was that Dan's opponent was a monster, an elementary school student who threw at 130 kilometers per hour with his left arm. Dan felt discouraged. He could not see any way to get on base. The ball was too fast, and he was not used to left-handed pitchers. However, the coach reminded him that there was no pitcher who could not be beaten. The habits he showed while getting ready to pitch, his stance while preparing, and the pitching zone he liked to aim for were all points the coach asked Dan to carefully analyze in his opponent. That way, he would start to notice a nice weakness he could not see before. So Dan remembered that, in armed combat, it was standard for a right-handed person to take a left-handed stance, but Hugo stayed in an orthodox stance, forward with his left hand. With a long-range weapon stretched out in front of him, Dan could not compete in a long battle at that distance. The only wild card he had was Hugo Faggerty's blind eye, where his perception should be weaker, but Dan was sure that guy was making up for it with training and instinct. Dan knew that from that sideways stance and with his left eye blind, there had to be a huge unavoidable blind spot. So Dan was sure the rock he had thrown earlier had hit Hugo because of that blind spot. If he could use Hugo's blind spot and land just one clean hit, things could change completely. Dan knew he had a chance to do that. In that moment, Hugo tried to attack him again. Dan managed to dodge, but he dodged to the side Hugo could not see and tried to hit him with his baseball bat. But somehow, Hugo still managed to dodge, even with a blind spot there. What was obvious to Hugo was that as long as he knew which hand held the weapon, he would know the path of the attack. That was very clear to him, so he ended up hitting Dan with a knee to the face, making him bleed a lot and fall to the ground. Hugo started to believe Dan was running out of breath. He also admitted that Dan had remarkable physical ability, but that was all. To Hugo, Dan was just a street thug with no technique and no skill at all. In that moment, he was ready to end everything at once. But once again, Dan managed to dodge. He quickly picked up 3 rocks and threw one of them at Hugo's face, right toward the side where his eye was blind. Hugo dodged all of them, making it clear that it was a cheap trick. But then one of the stones got very close to the eye he could still see with. In that split second, Dan prepared himself to finish him off, which left Hugo in shock because he had no vision at all. Dan already made his baseball bat release a surreal energy, while Hugo even lost blood because of that rock hit. Then, suddenly, blood spread through the area. Hugo was completely shocked, and Dan had been pierced through by his sword. He had not managed to attack Hugo, who soon started smiling. Hugo wanted to give Dan credit, admitting that at least he had tried, and that was when Dan grabbed Hugo's blade, asking Brienne to finish it. At that exact moment, Brienne appeared behind Hugo. Then the scene suddenly shifted from absolutely nothing to a plant, and Alt stared at it, convinced that it was the herb for the antidote, until Elahosha smacked the shaft of her spear against his head, telling Alt to stop being an idiot, because that was just a weed. That left him with a huge bump on his head. She was irritated because he himself had said that the poison was not even from that region, making it clear to them, especially since Silas was acting just as crazy as Alt, that they would never find an antidote herb by simply wandering through the forest near Shiltrock. In the end, Celis tried to excuse it by saying that, at the same same time, they were also searching for the remaining beast tamer monsters, so they were basically handling both things together. It even seemed like Alyosha was worried about Mary, which honestly none of them should be, because Mary was unbearable. Still, Alyosha noticed that she was gathering vegetables, while Celis immediately got defensive, declaring that eating vegetables was good for one's health and that Alyosha could recover faster by eating them. Alyosha declared that it would be better to visit a herbalist in another domain instead of wasting time there, but then they suddenly heard a loud crash, which sounded like an explosion to them. Alyosha assumed there were still some beast tamer monsters left in the area, and soon smoke began rising into the sky. At that moment, the scene shifted to Ariel, who was heavily out of breath. She complained because she had hoped to finish things quickly and head back. Out of all possible things, she had ended up fighting a giant bear with extremely high magic resistance. Even knowing that, the idiot still decided to cast a skill called Judgment Hammer of the Heavens, unleashing a massive electric strike onto the giant bear. Although it was affected, the creature still remained standing intact. Then the giant bear opened its eyes and quickly moved to attack Ariel. She used her shield skill and successfully defended herself, immediately following it up with another ability called Piercing Freeze. The attack pierced the giant bear in several places. Without wasting time, she used yet another skill called Blizzard Chain, completely freezing the giant bear solid. Right after that, however, she became weak and dropped to her knees. That was terrible. She had used too many high-cost spells, and if Dan did not appear immediately, she could end up losing her life right there. To make matters worse, another monster appeared behind her, leaving Ariel horrified because the battle was not over yet. Realizing there was no way she could block the attack from that enormous monster in her current state, she suddenly saw it get struck by arrows. Celis had arrived at the perfect moment. Alyosha appeared as well, telling the pointy-eared elf to get out of there before rushing toward the monster with her spear. She managed to land a strike on the monster's arm, but it was nothing more than a scratch. At that moment, Ariel could only watch. Alt approached her, asking if she was able to stand. He helped her up and wanted to know where Dan and Brian were, unable to understand why the pointy-eared elf was alone. Ariel explained that Dan and Brian had gone after the beast tamers, while she had ended up following the trail of a monster. Alt did not even let her finish speaking, assuming he already understood the situation. Still, he admitted that he had never seen a monster like that before, and the elf explained that they were facing a Wendigo. She explained that it was a powerful monster that only lived in the far north. Alt immediately realized that the three of them alone would not be enough to defeat that thing. He asked if Ariel could still use magic. Apparently, he was blind, because he could not see that she was completely exhausted. She denied it, declaring that large destructive spells were out of the question. At best, she could still use low-cost magic. Then she told everyone to run immediately, because unfortunately, with the strength they had at that moment, there was no way they could win. The best option they had was to slow the creature down, escape, and ask the domain for help, but Alt somehow pulled courage out of nowhere and refused to flee. He declared that there were farms nearby with elderly people and children living there. If they abandoned the area, the villagers would not have the same ability to escape. By the time they reached the domain and returned with reinforcements, all those people would already be dead, so he believed it was better to stay. He told Ariel to go to the domain and ask for reinforcements, which made her extremely irritated because she was certain he would not survive for long. However, Alt admitted that he was fully aware of that. There was no way they could stop that thing, but he believed this was something they had to do. Buy enough time. Ariel became frightened because that guy genuinely did not care about his own life. At that exact moment, the Wendigo launched one of its attacks at Alyosha, but she managed to dodge it. She warned the pointy-eared elf that she needed to run because they did not have much time left. Watching the Wendigo standing before all of them, Ariel let out a sigh and declared that her stamina was terrible and that she could not run very fast. Because of that, she wanted to ask Celis for help. Alt looked confused. Ariel herself was not sure if they would succeed, but she still wanted to try. Then the scene shifted to Celis, who was running desperately. To her, the situation was a huge problem because the territory was extremely far away. At that pace, Celis believed she would never make it in time, until she suddenly spotted a carriage passing on the other side of the road. She recognized the crest on it and immediately shouted to the man driving the carriage, asking them to wait a moment. She asked whether he was from the Hunters Guild, but the man said nothing to her. Meanwhile, a woman wearing glasses poked her head out from inside the carriage, wanting to know why he had stopped. The man himself did not even know what to say, while Celis desperately asked them for help, explaining that her comrades were in danger. Even then, the carriage kept moving as if they did not care at all, until the woman with glasses noticed the emblem on Celis's clothes and declared that such a thing could not happen. She could not allow precious hunters to get hurt. Then that mysterious woman, who also had companions inside the carriage, asked Celis to guide the way. Celis stood there speechless for a moment. Right after that, the scene shifted back to Ariel, who was facing that enormous creature as it tried to attack her. Alyosha immediately rushed forward together with Alt, hoping Ariel was alright, and the mage felt grateful toward the two of them. Alt quickly realized that the situation was even worse than he had imagined. First of all, the creature's skin was far too thick for their blades to pierce. On top of that, the Wendigo clearly possessed possessed intelligence because it kept targeting Ariel specifically. Alyosha was shocked because neither she nor Alt could break through that armor, so she hoped the elf had some kind of plan. Ariel then declared that she might still be able to use offensive magic one more time, but the casting would take time. Alyosha loved hearing that. Even though she knew they only had one chance, she still became confident. Alt, on the other hand, was terrified. At that moment, the Wendigo tried attacking the three of them again. Alyosha, being far braver, leapt forward. Alt attacked from below while Alyosha struck the Wendigo head-on, as Ariel continued chanting her spell in the background, but both of them were left in disbelief at what happened. They had dealt absolutely no damage to the Wendigo. Meanwhile, Ariel remained fully focused on completing her spell. The Wendigo continued fixating on her, and Alyosha shouted for Ariel to draw its attention away. But Ariel needed more time. The Wendigo was just about to tear a chunk out of her, and she did not even notice until she opened her eyes and saw that grotesque creature right in front of her face. Then suddenly, before it could make her its next meal, the Wendigo was struck by a brutal slash, sending blood spraying everywhere. Ariel collapsed to the ground, and the person responsible for that devastating wound immediately approached her to ask if she was alright. It was that goofy girl who had been traveling with the mysterious woman in glasses. She reached out her hand toward Ariel while smiling warmly at her. The pointy-eared elf honestly thought that goofy girl was adorable. Meanwhile, Alyosha and Alt rushed over in panic to check on Ariel. Ariel explained to her comrades that she was alright thanks to that goofy girl who had suddenly appeared. Alt thanked her for protecting Ariel, but then he noticed that she possessed a platinum seal. The girl simply declared that it was nothing special. She had only done what any hunter would naturally do, and the name of that platinum seal hunter was Danto Vistian. Soon afterward, the silent woman arrived together with Celis. The woman observed the situation and commented that fortunately, she had not arrived too late. Celis became incredibly relieved after seeing that all of her friends were safe, while Alt admitted that it had been a very close call. At that moment, the woman with glasses called out to Ariel while pointing toward the giant bear that had been completely frozen solid, asking whether she had been responsible for that. Ariel confirmed it and thanked them for their help, but she also wanted to know who they were. The woman with glasses then realized that she had not introduced herself yet. She explained that she was one of the masters of the Hunters Guild. Her name was Lee Yeryung. That revelation shocked all of them. The Hunters Guild was an organization founded to professionally hunt monsters. Originally, its purpose had simply been to protect every race from monsters, but under that noble mission, the guild had expanded and eventually become a global organization that transcended the interests of individual nations. Within the Hunters Guild, there were mainly two types of roles. The first was the combat role of hunters, who directly hunted monsters. The second consisted of support positions that assisted hunters. Hunters themselves were distinguished by only one thing: the rank of their badge, which was assigned exclusively based on skill and reliability. Support personnel, however, were divided into many different positions and duties, such as receptionists, treasurers, branch managers, and others. At the very top of the organization stood the three guild masters, who supervised all hunters and support staff alike. Each guild master oversaw 1/3 of the continent of Eldrabia, the west, the center, and the east. The authority and power of a guild master could only be compared to that of a king. In truth, it went even beyond that. Meanwhile, Lee Yeryung found herself thinking about the giant bear, a creature that rarely appeared in the forests of the southern continent, as well as the Wendigo, which normally lived in the frozen polar regions of the north. Neither of those creatures belonged there. Lee Yeryung wanted to know how someone had managed to move monsters that massive without being detected. Soon she explained that she needed everyone to go with her, because she wanted to hear a complete explanation of the entire situation. Naturally, Dan's companions became worried. However, Ariel explained that they could not deal with that at the moment, because her companions were searching for beast tamers, and they could be in danger right now. Hearing that while crushing her cigarette, Yeryung wanted to understand the situation a little better. Then Ariel explained that they were searching for the suspects behind that entire incident. According to the guild's investigation, she also revealed that she had sensed magic nearby. After hearing about the incident she was referring to, Lee Yeryung wanted to know whether she had authorization from the guild before investigating. That caught the mage off guard because she really did not have any. Lee Yeryung did not like hearing that they were conducting an investigation on their own. Since they had found potential suspects, they should have filed a report with the guild because it could turn into a political matter between nations. Hunters are forbidden from getting involved in matters tied to national or organizational interests, and she reminded everyone of that. Ariel tried to explain herself, but she had no arguments. Even so, Lee Yeryung decided to overlook it because she wanted to know who was responsible for what was happening. Then she asked the mage where her companions were, wanting to know the location where the beast tamers had supposedly been seen. The big problem was that the pointy-eared elf had no idea because she had gotten lost on the way. Leaving Alyosha and Alt completely confused, Yeryung could hardly believe what she was hearing. Then the scene shifted to Briand, who was about to put an end to the fight between Hugo Faggerty and Dan. However, that damned blind man suddenly drove an elbow straight into his face, though at the same time he also took a blow to the body. Briand had managed to land a hit, and and he became furious. But Dan, even with a sword piercing through his body, still punched Hugo in the face, making him fall to the ground. Hugo could not believe he was losing to those two. Dan was breathing heavily while that blade remained lodged in his body. Briand was also in terrible shape, and his face was covered in blood. Dan quickly pulled the blade out of his body, realizing how insanely exhausting all of this was. At that moment, the baseball bat began to reveal its energy, and Dan became completely bewildered. The powerful and mysterious energy coming from that baseball bat was about to devour someone, and Dan had not expected that at all. Briand also looked visibly frightened. Dan moved toward that energy and began pulling it away, making it clear that it could not consume anyone. Briand could not understand what the hell he was trying to do, and Dan placed that energy on the ground, telling it to wait for a moment. Then Ariel called out to Dan because she had arrived together with the master of the Hunters Guild. Dan could not understand anything that was happening, while Lee Yeryung found what she was seeing quite interesting. Soon after, the scene shifted to Lee Yeryung's office. It was very stylish, and she was smoking a cigarette. Dan wanted to have a word with her, so he entered her office, and she immediately asked whether he had slept well. He felt a little uncomfortable, but he confirmed that he had. He had already explained to her that he came from another world, and he knew that was something extremely strange to hear. Yeryung also already knew that in the Eastern Forest, he had killed a wyvern with a single strike. He had also killed Hugo Fagerty, the assistant to the Zodiac of the capital. Dan made it clear that Briand had helped a lot, while she continued reading the hunter's reports. Dan had come from the direction of the land of the dead, and he explained that when he fell into that world, that was where he had landed. Lee Yeryung wanted to know whether he knew anything about the Lich. At that moment, he became slightly frightened. He gave no answer. Soon afterward, she asked how long he had been in the guild, and according to him, it had been around 10 days. Seeing how inexperienced he was, it was difficult for her to say she could fully believe him. She wanted to know whether he understood the reason why people like her existed to provide support, making it very clear that she was not there to take advantage of hunters or skim commissions. She was there to help hunters like Dan himself. She noticed that he had not realized it, but he had ended up attacking an officer of the Empire, which placed him in a very complicated position. She stepped very close to him, making him extremely nervous, while explaining that she could take care of the matter for him. But before any of that, she suggested that they should both be honest with each other. Lee Yeryung was truly very intimidating, and Dan had no idea what to do. Then the scene shifted to Briand, whose face was covered with bandages. He could only hope that Mary was alright. They had said that the antidote was truly effective, but even so, he was still worried. Then he opened the door to the room where Mary was staying and became completely stunned. She was with Veronica and the other companions. Mary was awake, smiling as she wished him good morning. Briand could not hold back his tears as he replied good morning to his lady. Soon after, the scene shifted to nighttime, specifically at the inn. At the inn that night, Mary had barely woken up and was already drinking. She wanted everyone to drink until they nearly dropped dead, declaring that it was courtesy of the oppressive nobles. It was a celebration for Dan and Ariel after their promotion in rank. Celis thought it was incredible because she had never seen anyone rank up so quickly, while Alyosha thought it was a shame that it had not been the entire group. Still, she hoped Dan would not look down on them, but Dan would never do that, feeling that he owed a great deal to Alt and the rest of the team. Meanwhile, Mary tried to make everyone drink until they were crawling around picking up coins off the floor, while Briand ruined all her fun by taking her mug away and making it clear that she was not 100% recovered yet. To her, however, one more sip was not going to kill her. The group spent their time talking and enjoying the moment. Dan ate as usual, while Briand wanted to apologize to him because he had let his emotions completely take over and ended up placing unreasonable demands on his partners. He also apologized to Ariel because they had nearly paid the price for his mistake. Dan understood Briand because someone important to him had been in danger, so he knew he would have done the same thing. Briand truly felt that he would never forget the debt he owed Dan. Then the scene shifted to the underground prison of Shiltrock. Hugo was there, imprisoned. Lee Yeryung went to see him, declaring that his pointless stubbornness had ultimately led to his capture. Hugo, however, had nothing to say to her, and she already knew that. She understood that he was not going to talk. Their investigation had revealed nothing besides traces of magic, leading them to believe that teleportation magic had been used to move the monsters. As far as she knew, only a handful of mages on the continent could cast spells like that. Lee Yeryung suspected that a court sorceress from the Holy Empire might be capable of such magic, and she was already thinking about Aquanos herself. Hugo Fagerty noticed that all Lee Yeryung had were circumstantial pieces of evidence, and questioned what exactly she was trying to imply. Yeryung explained that Hugo had made her consider something, the possibility of revoking the guild's policy of staying out of conflicts between nations. Then the scene shifted to Dan waking up to someone knocking on his door. Completely exhausted, he answered it and found Ariel there, who could not believe he was still sleeping. She pointed out that he had no idea how far away Estine was, while Dan could not understand why she was in such a hurry. Soon after, the scene shifted to two badges, though Dan had no idea what they were. Lee Yeryung started believing that the guy might actually be blind, making it clear that they were copper insignias. She explained that the two of them had been promoted, citing the subjugation of the Wyvern, the Troll Horde, the Rocky Mountain Goblins, the Giant Bear, the Wendigo, and the capture of Hugo Faggerty. Their accomplishments were things that steel-ranked hunters simply should not have been capable of achieving, so she did not think it was an exaggeration to promote them to silver rank, considering everything they had done. However, all of it had been carried out without authorization from the guild, and above all else, she had not had enough time to determine whether he was truly trustworthy. Hunter insignias were not merely symbols of strength, they were proof of reliability, personally verified by the guild. Since he had spent so little time there, even that promotion was already highly exceptional. Still, Li Yeryung liked rewarding people fairly, so she handed him a recommendation letter she had written, explaining that it was a reward for answering her questions honestly. Dan had told her that he wanted to return to his original world. She admitted that she knew nothing about dimensional travel magic, but she believed that the prophet of Austin might know something. Meeting her was not easy, but with the recommendation letter, Yeryung assumed it should be enough. She also asked him to continue investigating Ainir, just as he had mentioned before. Dan became deeply grateful, while she made it clear that it would not be easy because he did not even know whether Ainir was a person, a place, or an object. Hearing that felt like a punch to the face for him. After that, she declared that they were free to go. Dan thanked her once again, while Li Yeryung, glancing at Ariel, began thinking about what Briand had said, and whether it could possibly be true. She had only gone there to confirm that the Lich's mana signature had disappeared, but the entire situation had turned into a massive headache she never expected. Then the scene shifted to Celis in a panic, violently throwing open the door and calling for Dan. She wanted to know whether it was true that he was leaving that very day, only to find him and Ariel sitting on the bed together. Dan had no idea what was going on. Alt was with her, and quickly warned Celis that she could not just barge into other people's rooms like that. Seeing Dan and Ariel together, he found the situation extremely suspicious. Alt immediately felt that he and Celis should probably give the two of them some privacy, but Dan made it absolutely clear that it was not what they were thinking. Soon after, they headed outside to the south gate of Shiltrock, where Alt thanked the two of them for the time they had spent together. But Dan felt that he should be the one thanking them, because he would never have accomplished anything without their help. Soon after, Briand arrived with his group to say goodbye, thinking it was too soon for Dan to leave already. Dan explained that he needed to find a way to return home as quickly as possible. Then Veronica handed something to him, explaining that her family lived in Astin, and if he delivered that item to them, they might be able to help him. She felt that she could not let them leave empty-handed. In the end, Celis had already decided in her mind that she was going to marry Dan someday, hoping that he would return. The carriage bound for Astin was about to depart, and Briand asked Mary to speak with him. She struggled quite a bit, but eventually declared that the oppressive nobles would repay the debt they owed him, though he should not let it get to his head. She also promised that she would help him with whatever he needed. Dan was happy to know that he had allies, but he punched her on the head just to stop her from acting foolish. Briand realized that showing gratitude was truly difficult for Mary. Then the pointy-eared elf and the poor guy who had come from another world said goodbye to the comrades they had made there. However, not everything in Dan's life could go smoothly. The scene shifted to him lying on the ground. The carriage had been completely destroyed, proving to him that this journey would not be easy at all. Then the story went back to a little before that happened. The carriage had been traveling peacefully, while Dan curiously asked what Estein was like. He wanted to know whether the elf knew anything about the city, and she explained that it was one of the 7 major cities of the Republic of Lokamir. Dan assumed it was much larger than Shiltrock, and Ariel made it very clear that there was no comparison at all. In her eyes, Shiltrock was tiny. She also mentioned that the food there was delicious, though she reminded him that they were not traveling there for a vacation. At that moment, Dan hoped that the prophet would truly know how he could return home, and that he would finally discover what Ainir really was. Suddenly, the man driving the horse began screaming. The two inside the carriage had no idea what was happening, until a gigantic monster grabbed the horse while the driver desperately cried for help. Dan could not believe that something like that was happening. To him, it felt completely nightmarish. The elf also could not understand how everything had happened so suddenly. Ariel's hat was blown away, but Dan did not care because he could always buy another one for her later. But the crazy Ariel suddenly jumped out of the carriage just to grab her damn hat, leaving Dan completely speechless. No matter what, he was certain he was completely screwed. The carriage detached from the horse and began plummeting downward in a free fall. Dan started crying, thinking that in the end he had lived a pretty good life. After being violently smashed around by the trees during the fall, there he was on the ground, unable to believe that he had survived. Feeling incredibly lucky to have escaped with only a few scratches, he realized he had not broken any bones. Still, he desperately wanted to know whether Ariel was alright. Then the scene shifted to the elf mage, who had protected herself with shield magic. She had also escaped unharmed, though she had no idea where she was. They were deep inside a forest. Soon after, she noticed that she had twisted her ankle without even realizing it. Her situation was terrible, because monsters could be heading in her direction at any moment. She decided it would be better to send up a signal so Dan could find her. Considering his physical abilities, she was certain he had not suffered any serious injuries. Then she launched the signal into the sky, and Dan ended up seeing it, relieved that she was safe. Meanwhile, there were some people near him shouting Betty's name repeatedly. She herself did not understand what was going on, and the whole thing seemed like complete chaos to her. Betty was a rather airheaded girl, accompanied by a giant eyeball creature named Moog. There was also a guy called Meaty Mound, who looked extremely excited while announcing that he had found an incredible fish market. Betty became very happy upon hearing that, and immediately wanted more details. Then the scene shifted to nighttime. Ariel was still in the same place, trembling in fear. She tried convincing herself that she was only hearing wolves, and besides, she could deal with an entire pack using magic. Yet she could not shake the feeling that she was no longer the same person she used to be. At that moment, she remembered when an elf had asked her to wait for a moment, saying that he was her father and that he was going somewhere with her mother. He told her that they would come back for her. Ariel did not want to stay alone in a dark forest like that, and she could not believe her parents were leaving her behind by herself. Then the scene shifted to Dan arriving and calling out to her. He became awkward when he saw that she was crying, while she wanted to know why he had taken so long. Dan apologized to her for that, and then he started walking while carrying her on his back. She apologized for making him do that and asked if she was too heavy, but he declared that she was extremely heavy. She immediately got angry and started hitting him, while he pretended it was only a joke. In the end, he wanted to set up camp because it had become too dark, but then they spotted a light ahead. Betty noticed them and asked what brought such a young couple to a forest like that. Dan and Ariel introduced themselves, and Dan awkwardly greeted everyone. Soon after, they sat together with the group, who were roasting some skewers over the fire. Dan thanked them for inviting the two of them to join the campfire, explaining that they had been searching for a place to stay during the night. Betty said it was nothing unusual, since travelers should always help one another, and she offered some meat to him. Dan then offered the meat to Ariel, but she did not feel like eating. Betty quickly became curious and asked if they were dating. Dan denied it, explaining that they were only companions. Hearing that, Betty saw an opportunity to flirt with him, leaving him extremely embarrassed. She then declared that she was only joking, though she admitted that his reaction had been very cute. The long-eared elf simply stared blankly at that ridiculous moment. Meaty Mao commented that the two of them looked like hunters and wanted to know where they were heading. Dan, sounding somewhat uncertain, informed them that they were going to Astine. The group assumed they were going there to participate in the gladiator tournament held in the city, but Dan denied it, explaining that he needed to find someone. Moog remained silent and continued eating peacefully. Dan became interested after hearing about the gladiator tournament and wanted to take a look, but Ariel did not seem interested. Everyone eventually finished eating, while the long-eared elf still did not look very well. Betty looked at her and declared that she had already stayed there for long enough and was going to sleep. Dan wanted to know where they were going, and Betty explained that they were going to light another campfire and sleep elsewhere. He did not understand, since they could simply stay there, but Betty explained that there was no problem with them lighting another fire. She told the two of them to get some rest before the group eventually left. At that moment, the mage explained that he did not need to worry, because she was certain those three were doing that for their own sake. It was common for travelers to share meals when they met, but sleeping separately was an unwritten rule. Dan did not know that, and it was all a matter of trust. Ariel herself would have refused if those three had slept beside them. Dan kept learning things from Ariel, just as he had learned from Chloe. Then the elf asked him to get some sleep, while he insisted on checking her injury. She tried to act as though everything was fine, but he made it very clear that he would be the one to decide that. So he examined her wound while she died from embarrassment. To him, it only looked like a mild sprain. When he pressed on it, she felt intense pain and begged him to stop, but he wanted her to stay still. He felt like a professional doing that. And to him, the elf was exaggerating by struggling around so much. She explained that she had walked all day and felt embarrassed because her feet smelled bad. He found that funny, since he had assumed it was something more serious, but he assured her that the smell was bearable. She immediately started hitting him again, and after all that terrible suffering, he wrapped her foot properly and put everything back in place. His head was covered in bumps, and he explained that he used to get hurt a lot while practicing sports, so he knew how to handle those things. When she first met him, Dan had been clumsy and unreliable, but the more time she spent with him, the less she understood about this whole saving the world business. He then told her that she should go to sleep. Dan hoped that she would not snore. After that, the scene shifted to Ariel, lying down while staring at him. She watched him sitting beside the campfire and could not understand why he was going so far for her, especially when she had simply followed him out of nowhere. She felt that he trusted people far too easily. She needed to recover so she could protect him, because she was certain he was nothing more than an idiot. Suddenly, she woke up screaming, wanting to know what the hell had happened. Dan woke up in shock as well, and also wanted to know what had happened. The entire place was a mess. She swore that he had been watching over everything the whole time, and since he had been sleepy, he should have woken her up instead. The elf was certain that it had been the work of those three people. They had obviously waited for them to fall asleep so they could steal everything. She admitted that she had already been suspicious of them from the start. Dan was completely stunned because he had thought they were nice people, and in the end, he had fallen for it like a complete fool. Then the scene shifted to those three bastards walking along the road. Met Mao was bragging about about their success, saying that they were definitely going to make a fortune by robbing those two. Betty admitted that he had done an excellent job, and to her, Dan and Ariel looked like complete rookies who understood nothing. The elf's bag had been a true gold mine, containing around 3,000 crowns. Mao was extremely happy, while Dan himself had not carried much money, but they had found a very valuable document inside his bag. They still did not fully understand what it was, so they decided to take it to an information broker. Meanwhile, Moog was trembling, which made the other two think something suspicious was going on. In the end, they reminded the big guy that they had specifically told him not to touch the baseball bat. Moog admitted that he had ended up grabbing the weapon anyway, and all he could say was that it was a monster. Betty and Mao found it strange to see Moog acting like that. Betty asked what exactly he meant, and Moog explained that there was a monster living inside that weapon. The other two did not believe him, but they assumed that would only make the weapon even more valuable. Then the scene shifted back to Ariel, who was furious, while Dan looked extremely awkward because he had completely messed up. He tried to act as though everything was fine, saying that they could always earn more money, but the elf declared that she had lost around 3,000 crowns. Dan was completely stunned, because that amount represented 100 days of lodging and food. At that moment, all he could do was apologize to her. Afterward, they opened the map, which was all they had left from their belongings. Dan also wanted to know how her ankle was doing. Ariel said that she would be fine as long as she walked slowly, which came as a relief to him. The problem was that they had also lost their compass, although Ariel still had the compass she had used to find him. However, it was useless now, because ever since she found him, the compass had stopped working. Dan had no idea what they should do next. They had barely traveled by carriage, meaning Astin was still extremely far away, and he did not know if they should simply keep walking until they found someone. Li Yeryung had been right. His journey would not be easy. The scene then shifted to them walking through the forest. Dan found some fruits, but the elf informed him that they were poisonous. They continued walking until they found mushrooms, and afterward, he tried to start a fire. However, Ariel lit the fire almost instantly, leaving him feeling pathetic and useless. After that, they placed a cauldron over the flames and prepared a nice stew. Ariel became very happy with the flavor, realizing that he could cook far better than she had expected. Dan explained that he had spent a long time camping and had learned a lot from Ares and Chloe. The elf mage wanted to know who he was talking about, and Dan described them as saviors because they had saved him from dying in the desert. He wondered how those two were doing now, and Ariel asked where they had gone, but Dan was not sure. They had left in a hurry, leaving behind only a small letter for him. Ariel was shocked that they had abandoned Dan alone in the land of the dead, finding it unbelievably cruel, while Dan imagined that they must have had their reasons. Ariel, however, declared that she would never do something like that, leaving Dan confused. She clarified that even if something urgent happened, she would never abandon him. That completely left him speechless, especially because she sounded extremely firm about what she was saying. Dan realized that Ariel truly believed he was the hero from the prophecy, which was why she was so desperate to help him. He wanted to know if she still thought that, even knowing that he might not actually be the hero she was searching for. Ariel replied that she was certain he was the hero because her master had never been wrong before. Dan then asked whether she would still think the same way if he returned to his original world, leaving everything behind and going back home. If he had the opportunity, he admitted that he would do it without hesitation, so he wanted to know if she would still help him regardless of that. Ariel did not know what to say. In the end, Dan asked if the hat belonged to her master. She wanted to know how he had figured that out, and Dan guessed it because she had jumped down from the sky without hesitating for even a second. He explained that he understood how good it felt to have someone you could admire and respect, but that did not mean she had to live exactly the way that person wanted her to live. He himself did not feel like the hero she claimed he was. If the only reason she had followed him was because the compass her master left behind pointed toward him, then maybe she should reconsider her choice more carefully. That left Ariel slightly downcast. Dan then informed her that he would sleep first and asked her to wake him up when it was time to switch shifts, and if she changed her mind, he told her not to hesitate to follow her own path. After that, he lay down while she remained there holding the compass in her hands, not knowing what she should do. Meanwhile, Dan himself had not even fallen asleep yet. Then the scene shifted to the next morning. Dan woke up after smelling something strange. He looked behind him and saw the long-eared elf asking whether he had finally woken up. He did not understand why she had not woken him earlier, but she explained that she did not want to disturb him because he looked exhausted. She served some food for him to eat and admitted that she felt a little guilty for making him handle all the work until then. She had used the leftovers from last night's dinner to prepare the meal. She also asked him not to jump to conclusions because she was not helping him only because of her master's prophecy. She had her own reasons for doing so she would continue moving forward, and when the right moment came, she wanted to see where all of this would lead her. Dan became happy after hearing her answer and thanked her. Then he declared that he was going to try the food. The moment he tasted it, however, however, he spat everything directly into her face because he thought it tasted absolutely horrible. He wanted to know what the hell she had done to the food, because it tasted as though she had mixed literal crap into it. Without saying a single word, Ariel simply activated her Judgment of the Hammer of Heaven ability, causing a massive bolt of lightning to crash directly onto Dan.